Hello, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fifth event that we've got within Cyberfest 21, the Northeast's biggest and greatest cybersecurity festival. Delighted to see you all here, although I can't see you because you're online, but there you go, you know what I mean. We've had a great registration so far for this event, and looking forward to it very much. So we've got, as I've said, we've got 14 events across this year. This is number 5. Look out for the rest, and I'll come back to that later on in the event. Claire, if you could put up my slides, that would be great. Claire helps me in the background and just keeps me all sorted, and I don't think I could do this without her. So I think the first thing to say is that this event is co-hosted with the Northeast Initiative on Business Ethics, the Northeast Fraud Forum, and the Northeast Business Resilience Centre. It could well be that this is the last event for the Northeast Fraud Forum. I think that they are merging with the NIBE. Details to follow, and we'll see how that goes. Can I have the next slide, please, then, Claire? So this is the format for today. I'm going to do a short introduction into Cyber North, and I'm going to be followed by, well, I was going to be followed by Alan Brown, but he's not going to actually speak today because of what I've just talked about in terms of the net. Then we've got Paddy, good friend of mine, going to talk about the relationship between cybersecurity and fraud. And then we've got a view from the lawyers, Jonny, and also Peter, I think, from WDB, Womble, Dickinson will be talking. And then after that, we're going to be followed by a discussion from Sharon, McDonald, and Dominc from Sunderland University are going to talk with Paddy and Jonny and Peter about what more can the police, business and public do to help each other. Then we're going to have a discussion on the whistleblowing policy from can that help cybersecurity and fraud prevention, from Elizabeth Gardiner, Chief Executive Protect. And then we were due to have Andrew Parkin, a client director from Bollington, to talk about can you ensure your way out of cybersecurity. I'm not sure if he is going to be able to attend, so we'll just have to see how that goes. I think some personal issues might get in the way. And then finally, another really good friend of mine, Caroline Theobald, is going to wrap this up with a discussion and Q&A on the ethics of action or inaction around cybersecurity. And then I'll wrap up with where we go from here. So next slide, please, Claire. What is Cyber North then? Well, it's the cybersecurity cluster for the Northeast, and this event is brought to you by Cyber North. It's Dynamo's cybersecurity cluster, hence the orange in the background, covering the whole of the Northeast region, supported by Accenture and the Innovation Super Network. Very grateful for them for their continuing support and helping us to get this going. So we're recognised by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. I'm glad I'm not down there today, but there you go. And the National Cybersecurity Centre as representing the region. But we're also members of the UK Cyber Cluster Collaboration, which does what it says in the tin. And I think I will mention that perhaps later on as we go through this meeting. And also Global EPIC, an international collaboration of cybersecurity clusters. So we have good presence locally, regionally, nationally, and now internationally. So we're working to grow the industry across the region, to position it as a great place to do cybersecurity business. So we're working to grow jobs, highly skilled, well-paid and interesting jobs. And we're doing this in 4 ways. The first is to make a lot of noise, to raise awareness and build belief within the region. We do this through events culminating in Cyberfest, the Northeast, as I've said, biggest cybersecurity festival, during September. We've certainly made progress in this area and very pleased with what we've done so far. The second thing, though, is that we help existing businesses to grow in a collaborative yet competitive framework. We're working on mechanisms to support this and bring opportunity to the 70 or so cybersecurity businesses here in the Northeast. We're also, the third thing, is trying to create new businesses by developing a cybersecurity innovation centre, or ORCANE is what we're calling it, somewhere in the region. We're working with Newcastle University, Accenture and Plexel, who run something similar in London, to try to develop this. The full business case is now with central government, and we're waiting to find out whether funding will be made available. But obviously we're talking with other people about possible funding. And the fourth thing, and by no means the least, is we're trying to support young people and people who are thinking about career change into careers within the cybersecurity sector. So we undertook a large piece of work earlier this year with the support of DCMS, and we're working on the plan to address skills immediately after Cyberfest. Next slide, please, Claire. I said I'd come back to UKC3, or the UK Cyber Cluster Collaboration, and this is bringing all of the UK cybersecurity clusters together. It's an exciting new venture. So we're going through a process of recognition for the clusters that exist. I think there's about 20 across the country. We've recognised 7 or so far, and another 6, I think, are in train. So Cyber North has been one of those recognised clusters, and the group itself is going to try and corral or coordinate some activities across the whole country, particularly around ecosystem development, innovation and skills. So very much mirroring what we're talking about within Cyber North. DCMS has given us some financial support, and from that Cyber North has got some money. We put a small team together of I think half a dozen people now who are going to work with us over the next 6 months to get a better understanding of the local market, what it needs, what it wants, where it's at, better engagement with that market, and understand how we can continue to support the businesses going forward and give us clearer direction for the next few years. So final slide then from me, Claire. So hopefully you've seen there's a rather large amount of stuff going on within Cyber North. So if you're involved in the regional cybersecurity scene in any way, please be part of what it is that we're doing. Thank you very much. Okay, can I now then pass on to Paddy, if you're there, if you could bring your screen up, and it'd be great to hear from you.
Hi Phil, hi everyone. Hopefully that's working there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Phil, thank you for the opportunity to speak today on the subject of the crossover and the link between fraud and cyber security. I think it's an important one, and certainly one that is aligned to those objectives you've just spoken about with regards to Cyber North. I will share my screen and see how we go with this then. Right. Now, there is a problem that we all face on a day-to-day basis, and that problem is called fraud. In the last financial year, there were 875,622 reports of fraud in the UK, with a reported loss of £2.35 billion. These are truly huge numbers. They equate to almost 2,399 offences of fraud each day. And from a policing point of view, over a third of all recorded crimes, which proves that you are more likely to be a victim of fraud than any other crime type. However, the sad fact is that this problem and the actual threat of fraud is much, much worse. To understand this, let me first explain what fraud is. In Section 1 of the Fraud Act 2006, a general offence of fraud is set out, and it explains that there are three key factors. The conduct must be dishonest, the intention must be to make a gain or cause a loss or the risk of a loss to another, and the third point is that no gain or loss need actually have been made. Simply put, a fraud occurs because of the offender, their conduct, their intentions, and when identifying if a crime has occurred, success in this criminal endeavour is not the issue. This is why there is no offence in law of an attempted fraud. At the time the criminal's lies are told, whether that be in person, over the phone, in a text message, in a letter, or in an email, and the recipient has been opened up to the risk of loss, then the offence is complete. So let's look at those numbers in a different way though. There are about 68 million people in the UK. If we reduce that by 20% to take into account the under 18s, and I accept that this is oversimplifying it because they too could be impacted, that takes us to 54.4 million. So the 875,622 reports of fraud, that relates to about 1.6% of the adult population. But these figures are only the reports that people make. Now, with the understanding that fraud can't be attempted, and simply by applying our own everyday experiences, how many times have you been a victim? Who has received calls telling you about a car accident that wasn't your fault? Who has had texts from delivery companies for a payment to release a package? Or a bank getting in touch because of a tax rebate? Or a letter arriving telling you that you've won a competition you don't remember entering? Or even during a national pandemic, receiving offers of vaccines and cures? The list goes on and on and on. The brutal truth is that we are all victims. There is likely to be 100% saturation across the UK adults. So forget about the numbers and look around you. Look at your family, your friends, your work colleagues, even the people you pass walking down the street. We are all affected by this. Now, some people may think, yeah, I get them all the time, but I know it's a scam. I just delete the message or I hang up. Well, this is really, really fantastic. And I'm happy every time I hear about someone who does this, because I know that you haven't suffered any loss. However, it brings up two significant issues that we need to think about. Firstly, the language that is commonly used. When we hear the words fraud, and to a greater degree scam, they lack the impact to adequately communicate the type of criminal offences we see every day. Offences which can have a huge impact on a victim's livelihood and their health. In my opinion, they are a bit of a softer touch as descriptors, and they can bring about thoughts of white collar crime or Del Boy style wheeler dealers. Having seen the true impact that fraud can have on individuals and businesses, I much prefer the term financial abuse. The second thing we should be conscious of is that we find ourselves in the fortunate position where financial abuse has not had a significant impact on our lives. Then what you've got to remember is, please do not underestimate your foe, and instead recognize that we are all in an ongoing battle. The criminals responsible for financial abuse through frauds are devious and clever. They use different tactics and ploys to manipulate us in order to elicit an emotional response rather than a rational one. The narratives these criminals use can take many forms. It may come from a place of trust or authority, where the message claims to be from someone official, for example, your bank, a solicitor, or a government department, the police, or even your boss. These organisations and individuals look after our best interests, and so criminals will impersonate them for their own gains. Scarcity is another tactic, something that is in short supply, like concert tickets, money, or a cure for medical conditions. Our fear of missing out on a good deal is being leveraged against us, so we respond quickly. Consequences, whether positive, and that through responding you will gain some type of reward for your engagement, be that free products, a new client, or simply cash, or alternatively negative with the resulting threat, where there is a need to respond within a limited time period, and if you don't, there will be consequences such as the threat of fines or court action. And furthermore, criminals will be agile and will pivot to current events, exploiting news stories, large events, or times of the year. And this way, the lies they tell seem more relevant to you and what is going on in the world around you. Whether it be reward, threat, trust, or scarcity, criminals are always trying to find the right lie just for you, to generate your emotional response and to get you to act quickly. The good thing is there is a process to help us respond to this threat. The Take 5 to Stop Fraud campaign sets out a 3-stage response to combating this. Stop. Taking a moment to stop and think before parting with your money or your information could keep you safe. Challenge. Could it be fake? It's okay to reject, refuse, or ignore any requests. Only criminals will try to rush and panic you. And protect. Contacting your bank immediately if you think you've fallen for a scam and reporting it to Action Fraud. So that's fantastic. We have a process to keep us safe, but it begs the next big question. How do we get the 54 million victims in the UK that includes you and me, our friends and loved ones, to use this framework every time we are targeted. How do we create the good habits that will help us respond in the right way to these threats? Because to create habits, process alone is not enough. I know that if I want to be fitter and healthier, I need to make better food choices and exercise regularly. However, knowing what to do is not the same as doing it each and every time. In the words of James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, if you don't do it consistently, it's not a habit, it's a hobby. When it comes to habits and behaviours, psychologists often refer to the think, feel, act cycle. This is the stories we tell ourselves and we think about that make us feel a certain way, which in turn impacts our behaviour and how we act. So it's not just what we communicate to each other that keeps us safe, but also how we communicate it. This is again where we find ourselves in the fortunate position of having a suitable narrative to convey these messages. The same first principle that the Take 5 campaign promotes, of not being rushed and taking a step back, is already embedded into our day-to-day life and our organisational structures. It is referred to as well-being. As our lives became busier and the lines between work life and home life became increasingly blurred, we saw the adverse impact it was having on us, and the well-being movement began to grow. Taking time for ourselves and our families, decompressing from the stresses of work where we can in order to find balance in our busy lives. Well-being began with a focus on physical health, and businesses started to offer gym access to their staff to help them stay fit and healthy as part of overarching well-being strategies. This then developed into looking after the mental well-being of ourselves and those around us, for instance, with training being delivered for mental health first aiders, improving our understanding and support of mental illness and mental health. Why then can the next evolution of this theme not be our financial well-being? Our responsibility as individuals and also within our organisations to take time to protect ourselves and others from the threat of economic crime. Raising awareness of how to stay safe. By taking time to make decisions, we create the stop necessary to consider our responses rather than being rushed into something. Each time we ignore an email or challenge a cold caller, we empower our own behaviour, taking control of the conversation and knowing that we grow stronger with each response. And that we take time to protect not only ourselves if we are a victim of fraud, but also those around us by talking about the tactics that these criminals employ. And best of all, you don't have to do this on your own. It is simply impossible for us all to be on the top of our game every minute of every day. We are human. We have good days and bad days. Days when we are full of motivation and days where the pull of Netflix is almost unsurmountable. So what happens on the days when we are less than 100%? Fortunately, there is an army of support. Organisations are doing more to protect our data. Banks and financial institutes have processes such as banking protocol, which provides the stop in what was a previously an automated process so that you, the customer, have the opportunity to consider the payments you are making. And law enforcement are no longer solely focused on pursuing those responsible for crimes. Alongside the resources available in Cleveland, Durham and Northumbria Police, there are also teams such as the Regional Economic Crime Coordination Centre and the North East's Regional Cybercrime Units, who work with businesses, communities and networks to develop a stronger and safer North East. Perhaps most importantly, with 80% of frauds being cyber-enabled, there is a fast-growing sector dedicated to cyber security. People who are used to continually adapting to previously unknown or unimagined threats. People who build safeguards into our day-to-day digital lives, who sit in the shadows but provide a shield of safety, keeping us and our data safe. While many of these security experts provide up-to-date threat analysis and protection to businesses, the same products are increasingly available to the individual, such as two-factor authentication or VPNs. And as those in the cybersecurity sector stop new threats and develop encryptions to combat them, they build our collective resolve even further. These are the people who keep us safe on our bad days. They are the personal trainer, the gym equipment, the supplements, and the diet plan, which all accelerate us toward our goal of being fitter and healthier. But none of that will get us there unless we take the time to understand our own role, our own responsibilities, and unless we take the time to look after our financial well-being. Thank you for your time. I'll stop sharing my screen and hopefully I should be coming back into the room.
That's great, Jonny. Thank you very much. And I noticed you didn't mention the C word this time here, because I remember hearing you talk about this before, and that fraud is basically crime, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's the language, again, we come back to, and certainly I have a real dislike of the term scam, but I think fraud as well is that soft touch. And yeah, I think the comment I've previously made is to encourage people to use the F word less than the C word more.
Yeah, absolutely. Because fraud does seem the more victimless, doesn't it? It's something, well, yeah, it's a bit of a laugh, a bit of a joke, whereas it really is a serious crime. It affects people's lives. It kills people.
It is, yeah. And that's, you know, I think the most adequate term is that financial abuse, because that is what it is. It doesn't fall short of that. And, you know, the understanding of anybody can be impacted by this, and we don't know how that's going to impact them until it happens. You know, you can take someone who doesn't on the surface appear vulnerable, but if they've clicked the wrong link, or they've, you know, become a victim to this type of offence and they've lost their life savings, or they've put their business at risk because of, you know, poor digital hygiene, which has allowed an offender into their system and allowed them to target it, the repercussions of that aren't known until it's too late sometimes. And that's why, you know, the old adage of prevention is better than the cure is front and center when it comes to this type of thing.
Yeah, I think there's a parallel between the fraud word and cyber kind of world, in that people again see cyber as, I think, a kind of victimless crime, or it affects those who can afford it, the big companies, the BAs, the Marriott hotels, that kind of thing. They've got money, they can afford it, but that's just not true. It affects all people. Definitely,
and I see that parallel that you bring up there. You know, cyber as well has an illusion that it's just specialist. You have to have, you know, high technical knowledge or anything like that. But in fact, you know, we all live digital lives. We all are, you know, a part of this larger cyber community. We carry around computers in our pockets, in smartphones and things like that. And we get a lot of benefits from that type of life. But it also means that there are risks, and there are things that we need to try and do just to keep ourselves safe. The fortunate thing is that through the cybersecurity industry, through work that lots of these large businesses and corporations do, there's lots of people fighting our corner as well.
Yeah, and of course it's much easier to attack than it is to defend, isn't it? Because you can attack multiple people at any one time. Just if when you get the chance, we will be publishing the videos from these events, and there was one on the 7th of September where Craig talked about how easy it is to use open source software, free open source software to do this. So quite terrifying. But he said that the third of crime was now fraud. That the police, there surely must be an underrepresentation of the amount of fraud that's going on.
Massively, and that's the reports. So to give scale, you know, what was it, 875,000 reports last year. We know that from the Police and Crime Survey of England and Wales, that the figures are closer to the 3.5 million mark. But again, I would much prefer it if people looked at, the tilt that I've explained there of saying, well, every single person that I know certainly has received a text message, has received a phone call, has received emails, and you can't attempt a fraud. So every time you've had one of those, that is someone committing a fraud. They're someone who's opening you up to financial abuse. And we're in the fortunate position where the majority of those people, yes, you are a victim of that crime type. You just haven't suffered a financial loss as a result of it. And that's what we need to really try and impact.
Yeah, I must admit, I nearly got caught out with the post office text scam that was going around.
Mm-hmm.
I was expecting a parcel for my wife. I didn't know what it was in, and it said you need to spend £1.59, I think it was. I was just about to put my bank details, and I thought, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I think it can affect all of us. But my final question for you, though, Paddy, is I was really interested by the line you said, that the right lie just for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think what cyber has been able to do, and being able to do these things online, is to personalize this fraud attempt much easier and much more en masse than you could do physically. Are you noticing that that kind of personalization of fraud?
We are, but what I would say is sometimes it's the feeling of it being personalized for you, because smishing texts and things like that people will send out, they'll send them out en masse. And if you get a text message from HSBC and you bank with Barclays, then when it says, there's something that's an issue with your bank account, you look at it, you think, right, I don't bank with HSBC, delete. And it doesn't feel personal. But if you get the same text message that has been sent out with Barclays written on it, you might delete it, but you'll certainly take a longer pause looking at it and go, is that real? Is it not? Shall I just check my bank account and make sure that there's not something there? And the criminals know this. So for them to send out thousands of text messages, and for one to be worded that it's HSBC, another to be worded Santander, another to be worded Barclays, it just has that feeling of being more personal to you. And yes, there are frauds where individuals are more targeted, potentially where there is things like payment diversion frauds, and they'll be trying to get into a company, so they might try to adopt the persona of an influential figurehead within the company so that other members of staff open their emails or things like that. But actually, a large proportion of fraud and a large proportion of these offences that have been carried out through digital devices, it's the feeling of it being personal rather than the attack actually being that way.
I think you're absolutely right, because that post office one felt personal to me because I was expecting something and it caught me on the hop, and I realised that. But those that I get from HSBC, because I don't bank with them, I just ditch. And you're right. I was going to let you off the hook there, but we just had a question from the audience. And okay, the police are going to be inundated with cases of cases of fraud that they could potentially investigate. How do you decide which ones are worth chasing and which are not?
We don't necessarily we do and we don't. The national reporting system for fraud is Action Fraud, and that is because of the sheer scale of this problem. If they take away the demand from forces of the vast majority of reports coming into them, and they're the national collection point for all of the fraud reporting. Now, what then happens is there are triages in place within that system that then identify lines of inquiry, and then they also identify certain high harm types and things like that, and they will then triage out, and they'll send out the investigations back into police forces. Obviously that means that every investigation does not get, or every report does not get investigated, and I think that's simply a demand and resources issue. There is so much of this, and it has accelerated so quickly that every single report could not be could not be investigated. But what they tried to do is they tried to make links, they tried to identify where reports are similar, where they potentially originate from the same criminal group that are responsible, and then prioritize those jobs to come out to law enforcement for investigation.
Okay, Paddy, that's really great. So the old adage, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. And just take that extra bit of care before you press those buttons. If you could hang on, Paddy, that'd be great. Because we have a bit of discussion coming up after the next speakers. We're Jonny Gribben, Managing Associate at Womble Dickinson, and Peter Wacrup, who's the Tech and Data Disputes Lawyer, again at Womble Dickinson. I think a job title that never existed when I was at school, but there you go. So, Jonny, Peter, could you come up, please? And while that's happening, I could just say that we are recording all the questions that I get sent through. If you could put them on the Q&A, and we'll be answering them all, those, including those that we don't get through today. We'll put those on a website that we've created, or a page on the website. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Paddy. That was really interesting. So I'm Jonny Gribben. I'm joined by my colleague Peter. And we're going to be discussing the lawyer's role in managing the aftermath of a cybersecurity incident. And we're going to be focusing on the legal issues from a civil law and from a regulatory perspective. So a different angle to the criminal law that Paddy's session touched on. But there's one very common theme running across those arenas, which is that these incidents are on the rise. And we'll touch on that. So I'm going to start by summarizing the potential legal consequences of an incident and looking at some of the current trends in these areas. I'm going to hand over then to Peter, who's going to delve into some of the detail and talk about some of the specific elements of the lawyer's role in the aftermath of an incident. And then we're going to end with an example of a situation where the victim of a significant ransomware attack was actually able to recover the sums that they'd had to pay over to the perpetrators to regain access to their systems with the help of their legal team. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Peter. So potential legal consequences of an incident from a civil law perspective. This can be claims by individuals or groups of individuals whose personal data has been accessed, and I'll come back to that on the next slide. It could be disputes between commercial partners. So for example, I'm currently advising in relation to a dispute about the termination of a contract, and one of the grounds of termination relied upon was that the personal data of one party's employees had been compromised whilst in the control of the other party. And third bullet, from a civil perspective, as I've already mentioned, there may be some scope to attempt to recover any sums that have been lost to the perpetrators of an incident. From a regulatory perspective, the potential consequences are investigations and the publication of the reports, the products of those investigations. That can give rise to significant reputational damage. The regulators also have powers to impose financial penalties, and consequences could even be the loss of certain regulatory approvals. So it's worth noting that civil and regulatory consequences, they're not mutually exclusive. So if you take the example of the well-publicized British Airways incident in 2018, that led to a regulatory investigation and a record fine. So that's the regulatory side, but it also led to a group action by around 500,000 people whose data had been compromised as a result of the incident. Just a quick look at some of the trends in both of these arenas. So the graph that appears on this slide is taken from an article that recently appeared in The Lawyer, which is our industry publication. The article was headed IP and Data Claims, A Rising Tide. And what it shows is that by the end of June 2021, the number of intellectual property and data claims issued in the High Court had risen by almost 320% year on year. So you can see it's the bottom line of that graph, and it's the increases, just dwarfs the others. So it was 243 claims in total in that short period. Now that's not just claims arising out of cybersecurity incidents, but a significant proportion of that number will be. One of the reasons for that is that there's been a rise in group litigation as a result of personal data breaches, and that's been described as the new PPI. You've got firms of solicitors who are advertising for individuals whose personal data might have been compromised by an incident to join claims against the companies who were the subject of the attack. And the tide may be about to get a lot higher in the near future, and that depends on how the Supreme Court decides a case called Lloyd and Google. The decision in that case could pave the way for US-style group actions, class actions. So at the moment, anybody wishing to participate in group litigation has to sign up at the beginning. Under the US model, one individual can bring a claim on behalf of an entire class of people. And if the claim is successful, everybody within that class can then apply for a share of the damages. Now, that type of group action is much more attractive for litigation funders. One of the reasons is that they only have to fund the costs of bringing one person's claim to a trial. And then if that's successful, they've accessed a pot of aggregated damages and they can take their share of that. So what it means is that incidents that are minor and would be not litigated at the moment because the economics don't stack up, that model makes it far more attractive for funders to pursue that type of claims. So, and they're going to be far more likely to be litigated if the Supreme Court sides with Mr. Lloyd. And just as an aside, his claim is on behalf of over 4 million people, and it relates to an allegation that Google used a workaround on Apple's Safari browser to bypass the blocking of third-party cookies and collect the browser-generated information. In terms of regulatory enforcement, there are a number of regulators that enforce cybersecurity laws in this jurisdiction, main one being the Information Commissioner's Office. Over the years, we've advised clients in relation to hundreds of potential breaches from a regulatory perspective. And our experience is that the volume of incidents is rising and that the regulatory scrutiny is really intensifying as well. As Peter will explain, data breaches have to be reported within a certain timescale. And the ICO reports that in the first quarter of the current year, there were 688 reports of personal data breaches as a result of cybersecurity incidents. That illustrates the scale of the issue. Not all of those reports will lead to enforcement action, but if the ICO decides to take enforcement action, the stakes can be very, very high. The ICOs imposed some big fines in recent years, and I've picked out a few on this slide. Looking at the BA case again, that fine was 20 million, reduced from an originally proposed 183 million. So quite a significant reduction, but it was still 1.4% of BA's annual turnover. And even if the regulator doesn't decide to impose a fine, they may still carry out an investigation, and the subject of that investigation is probably going to have to pick up the costs, which is a significant consequence. So I hope that sets the scene. I'm going to hand over to Peter, who's going to look at the lawyer's role in a little bit more detail.
Thank you. As Jonny mentioned, I'm going to do a bit more of a deeper dive into some of the sorts of issues that we typically encounter when we're actually acting on behalf of clients. By the time a cybersecurity incident has taken place, I think it's probably fair to say that the biggest, costliest, most urgent risks for an organisation are very likely going to be the legal and regulatory ones. A large cybersecurity incident will almost invariably involve personal data, at least to some extent. And it could be that the data has been jeopardized as a result of a ransomware attack, or data might have been accessed or exfiltrated by the attacker. Because issues associated with data breaches are the main risk, I'll mainly be talking around that kind of risk before considering some of the other associated problems that can arise following a cybersecurity incident. Almost invariably, the first legal and regulatory point to be considered is whether or not to notify the ICO. That obligation falls on data controllers who, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the data protection regime, very broadly, they're the party which exercises overall control over the purposes and means of the processing of that personal data. When making a notification assessment, if it's only corporate information that's involved, such as financial data, but no personal data, then this obligation will not be triggered, so there's no need to notify the ICO. However, if personal data has been affected, such as via unauthorized third-party access or exfiltration, then a notification to the ICO may be necessary. Obviously, this assessment in every case is fact-specific. The general test will be whether the breach creates risks to the rights and freedoms of the individuals whose data has been affected. However, the peculiar nature of cybersecurity incidents means that often, firstly, you don't have an accurate understanding of what precisely has been affected without undertaking a protracted investigation. And secondly, attackers often employ techniques to cover their tracks, so it can be very difficult to assess with any degree of certainty what's actually been accessed. So because of that, it'll generally be the case that cybersecurity attacks will warrant notification to the ICO. So where a data controller becomes aware of a reportable breach, they have only 72 hours from becoming aware to actually notify the ICO. And that time limit's a strict requirement. If an organization fails to comply, then it will need to be prepared to explain to the ICO why it didn't do so. But equally, depending on who the data controller actually is and their area of business, there may be other factors to consider. For example, if a communication service provider is affected, they've actually got less time to notify the ICO, having only 24 hours to do so. Equally, if a charity is involved, if they're subject to an attack, then there might also be a requirement to notify the Charity Commission, as charities are expected to make a serious incident report. Equally, if an affected organisation is subject to regulation by the Financial Conduct Authority, then they expect to be told about anything of which they would reasonably expect notice, and that would usually include serious data breaches. Where it's actually been assessed that it's necessary to notify the ICO, affected organisations should then consider if they're actually required to notify the data subjects themselves, that is, the individuals who have been affected. The threshold for whether a notification is required is whether the breach is likely to have had a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the affected individuals. So that's a higher threshold of harm than for notifying the ICO. And there may be instances where a notification is required to the ICO, but no notification is required to the individuals. And that'll depend on the types of data involved, perhaps the number of individuals. If it's determined that there is a high risk to the rights and freedoms of those individuals, then the data controller is required to notify those concerned without undue delay. And essentially that's to say that they must do so as soon as possible. The ICO, having been notified, will usually respond with a list of questions about the incident and about the organisation's general data protection compliance. And it's important to carefully manage the response to those questions, as that's going to determine the ICO's next steps. It could mean that they say, thank you, that's all the questions we'll have, and the matter's closed. Or it may mean that they choose to investigate further and exercise their powers. Their powers include firstly, the ability to issue enforcement notices, that's to do or not do something. Secondly, they can issue monetary penalty notices of the kind that Jonny was discussing. And they also have the power to carry out inspections. So an adverse decision by the ICO is a huge risk for affected organisations. Having to deal with a full investigation by the ICO not only risks an actual adverse finding, but by itself is extremely onerous. Likewise, as Jonny's already noted, there could be some significant fines imposed. Just reference the ones in BA and Marriott. However, arguably the bigger risk in relation to an ICO investigation and their decision is that it will open the floodgates to claimant law firms. And that's something that Jonny's already talked about. The BA recently actually settled one of the claims by one of the claimant law firms. And I believe that claim involved 16,000 claimants settling for an undisclosed sum. So you can begin to imagine the sums that were involved in that alone. And that doesn't even prevent other claimant law firms from coming along and trying to issue claims afterwards. Where an incident affects multiple jurisdictions, there can also be investigations by the data protection authorities in other countries as well. And that clearly requires the coordination between the legal advisors in the different jurisdictions to ensure that there's a consistent narrative. Otherwise, there's a risk that a response given to one regulator, let's say a regulator in Spain, is inconsistent with that given to another, say the regulator in the UK. And that could expose an organisation to liability, as one of those responses could be taken as admission. An example of why this is important is that we've recently acted on a large-scale data breach for a US client, which involved cross-jurisdictional elements. That involved liaising with lawyers in the US, Canada, Spain, and Ireland. And it's a really good example of how risk can easily multiply when additional jurisdictions become involved. As in one of those jurisdictions, one single complaint resulted in an investigation and fine. However, the key point to take away from all of this is that where those risks do exist, organisations have a very limited time to respond, so they must act quickly. Much as there's a requirement to notify regulators, organisations may also need to notify other third parties. If an organisation is a data processor, it will need to notify the data controller. And the exact requirements of the notification should be dealt with in a contract under a data processing agreement, for example, as that's a requirement of GDPR. Equally, it's possible that other contractual obligations may require affected organisations to notify other parties. And it may also be necessary to notify insurers, either because the organisation is required to do so under their policy, or because they're actually claiming under a cybersecurity policy. And it may, in some circumstances, be appropriate to notify law enforcement. As Jonny's already mentioned, there's also the possibility of other organisations issuing claims against an affected organisation, and an adverse ICO decision will typically prompt an even greater number of claims. Claims from affected data subjects, as Jonny's mentioned, are becoming increasingly common, and even small low-value claims tend to be very expensive and time-consuming to deal with individually. And claimant law firms are really very happy to incur significant costs, costs which often exceed the value of the compensation claimed many times over. So this is a real threat for businesses' bottom line. And again, as I noted earlier, an adverse ICO decision is a trigger for a great number of claims, and as Jonny mentioned, will give claimant law firms and litigation funders confidence that their clients' claims will be successful. Thankfully, though, there's been some recent case law which hopefully could rein in claimant law firms when it comes specifically to cybersecurity incidents or potentially accidental data breaches. However, because that decision was only made a couple of months ago, its effect is really yet to be felt. But equally, that good news is tempered somewhat because, as Jonny mentioned, we're still waiting on a Supreme Court decision which really points the other direction. So it's unclear which way the courts are pointing in terms of protecting rights or trying to allow businesses just to get on with things. But what's clear is that privacy claims will continue to be a threat to all kinds of organisations for the foreseeable future. So what role does an organisation's legal advisors play in responding to a cybersecurity incident? Well, legal teams specialising in cybersecurity and data breaches obviously have the experience and knowledge to help affected organisations to deal with each of the aforementioned risks and to help them plan in advance their incident response. They can help to minimise the risks associated with the organisation's regulatory compliance in the wake of an incident, and they can do so by advising on whether or not the ICO requires a notification. And then if the ICO then begins to issue questions, they can advise the organisation in answering those questions in a way that meets the ICO's expectations and minimises the organisation's risk. And likewise, they can assist in responding to any questions that are raised by individual data subjects. And one of the things that we often do is to prepare documentation that they can use to respond to any queries which data subjects might raise. And that might involve preparing a set of frequently asked questions or drafting a set of talking points for the organisation's staff so that they follow a clear and consistent narrative. Equally, an organisation's legal advisors can assist with communication to other regulators where relevant, so the FCA or the Charity Commission or whoever it might be in a particular instance. One of the things that the organisations also face is the claim against other from other organisations. And legal advisors are really key in understanding those risks. It could be that claims are based on data protection law, or it could be that they're based under contract. And legal advisors can help to prepare for this and prepare strategies for dealing with large volumes of claims. And they can push back on those by reference either to data protection law or to contract as relevant. And if appropriate, they can work towards settlements and help to negotiate that. But given the tight timescales involved in notification, an affected organisation's resources are likely to be stretched. Legal advisors can provide an additional resources at a short notice and can assist with, for example, the analysis of affected data to determine what was included and to identify which individuals actually require notification. And that's something that we often do. And we'll use specialist software and a large team of experienced paralegals just to churn through significant volumes of data very, very quickly. And by doing so, we can allow clients to notify affected individuals without any kind of undue delay. Now, as you might expect, legal advisors are there to provide an objective view. And that's particularly important when an organisation is subject to the pressure of an ongoing or recently discovered security incident. It's sometimes the case that those dealing with an incident will be facing internal resistance from colleagues who perhaps just don't understand or appreciate the risks involved. And the voice of outside counsel can help to persuade them. And although the answers we might give might well not be the ones an organisation wants to hear, ultimately our advice can give decision makers the comfort that they're making appropriate decisions in relation to what's obviously a very high risk problem. Legal advisors also play a key coordinating role with other advisors such as forensic IT investigators or PR firms. And there are likely to be many interlinked risks which require a consistent strategy. For example, if a PR firm is advising, then their narrative must match the legal one. Otherwise, an organisation's official narrative could inadvertently expose them to legal risk. So something we often do is help to formulate a strategy in advance and ensure that there's a consistent message delivered across the entire incident response. However, probably one of the more important benefits of engaging lawyers at an early stage is that may allow organisations to claim privilege over certain sensitive documents. And that means that they don't need to be disclosed in court proceedings or regulatory investigations, such as an ICO audit. That being said, the rules around privilege are complicated and they do only apply quite narrowly. So organisations conversely also need to have a clear audit trail. So they need to be able to justify their actions either in court if they're faced with litigation or to regulators in the event of an investigation. And if an organisation gets that wrong, the risks in correspondence and documents during litigation or during an investigation, which they would have really preferred to remain private. Lawyers can obviously help organisations understand what is and isn't going to be covered by privilege, but critically, they can also help organisations put in place systems and policies to properly manage their paper trails. Now, although most of what I've discussed really focuses on the immediate aftermath of an incident, I'll leave you with one further comment, and that's that the fallout of a serious incident can overwhelm affected organisations and those working for them. And when you're operating under that level of pressure, it can be very difficult to identify and deal with those sort of risks in a timely manner. So it's really extremely prudent to have a strategy in place for dealing with each of the legal risks that have been discussed, and to integrate your legal advisors, whether they're internal or external, into your incident response plan before an incident actually occurs. So I'm going to hand you back over to Jonny, who's going to consider some possible recourse against perpetrators.
Thanks, Peter. Just very, very quickly, I'm just conscious of time. This case is an example of the victim of an incident being able to recover sums that it had to pay over to the perpetrators to regain access to the systems. So AA against persons unknown, it was a ransomware attack on a Canadian company. The Canadian company had the benefit of cyber insurance. The insurer was based in Britain, hence why the proceedings were commenced in the English courts. So the insurer paid the demanded ransom in Bitcoin. After it, or during the process of organizing the payment, the insurer's technical experts were able to trace the Bitcoin to a cryptocurrency exchange, and the insurer's legal team was able to take that information to court, apply for an urgent injunction, freezing the asset on the cryptocurrency exchange, and then subsequently recover the Bitcoin before it made its way into the hands of the perpetrator. So this isn't to say that there's always going to be an ability to recover assets in the event of an incident, but it does illustrate that hope is not lost in those circumstances, and there may be scope to recover the assets in that event. So that was it. That was everything we wanted to cover, Phil, but happy to take any questions.
That was great. Thank you, Jonny and Peter, for that. That's kind of two interesting sides of the same coin. We've got a bit of time because I don't think one of the speakers is going to be available. So just a couple of questions for you. Mm-hmm. Where does liability lie? Because I'm interested in the case, I think, with Morrison's, the food shop, which was allowed to, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but they were allowed to appeal because the judge felt that they weren't vicariously responsible for the loss of the data. It was a rogue employee or something.
Yeah. What's
that all about?
So vicarious liability is, it's one of those areas of law that is very fact specific, and it's not black and white. So you're dead right, Phil. The question that the court had to determine in that case was whether the organisation Morrison's could be held vicariously liable, to use the legal term, for the acts of its employee. And it's been a while since I've looked at it. I think that on a claim involving vicarious liability, the employer will typically argue that the act of the rogue employee, we'll call them, was outside the scope of their usual remit of their employment. And Morrison's has been quite unlucky on the vicarious liability front, because they were sued in another case where one of their petrol attendants had actually assaulted a customer, and in that case they were also sued, and that made its way up the courts, I think, to the Court of Appeal. And so the issue to be determined by the court in most cases, and I think it's the same in the Morrison's cases, was the act of the employee sufficiently connected to their role as an employee to justify the employer being vicariously liable. But as I say, it's not a black and white area. It's very fact sensitive. But it illustrates that where a rogue employee does something like that, the organisation could potentially be liable.
Yeah, of course, we get to see the judgment and not all of the legal arguments that go through that. Yeah. So, but does this mean that there is a reasonableness in play here, and that if companies do what is reasonably could be expected by any company to do to protect their data, then that should be sufficient, or is that an absolute?
Yeah, I mean, the advice would be for employers to do what they can to prevent that from happening, but with the best will in the world, if a rogue employee wants to do something, they may find a way. So taking the steps you've described would help to try and argue that vicarious liability shouldn't arise, but I don't think it would be a silver bullet to the claim.
That certainly shouldn't be a leading argument, should it? Something else you mentioned was you talked about economic model. the law is notoriously not particularly cheap, and it must take quite a lot of money to bring some of these cases, which is why I think class actions are preferable. Does this mean that it pushes the crime down to smaller companies because they're unlikely to be able to afford the legal recuperation, as it were?
Yeah, so the costs of defending a class action are significant, you know, so large organizations more likely to be able to afford it. Small organizations may not have the luxury of being able to take legal advice, and may be more susceptible to that type of claim. Yeah, the economics is a big factor in it.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you very much for that, and thank you, Peter. I'm going to now bring up our next speakers, who are, if you just hang around, Jonny and Peter as well, because we're going to have a panel discussion. So, if I'm right in thinking, both there, Sharon McDonald and Dominc Button from Sunderland University. Are you there?
Hi, Phil.
Hi, I gather you might be sharing the same screen, but there you go, that's right. So this
we are pretending to be the two Ronnies today. Sorry for the unconventional way of joining the conference.
No, don't worry, just when I think everything's sorted, people always throw a curveball, so that's really great to see you, Sharon. So how about starting a bit of an introduction, Sharon?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me here today. My name's Sharon McDonald. I'm a chartered psychologist and a professor of human-computer interaction at the University of Sunderland. And my research interests surround cybersecurity, the general public and SMEs in terms of how we can raise awareness for cybersecurity issues and train people so that they can deal with these more effectively. And my co-conspirator.
Hi, my name is Dominc Button. I'm an academic tutor and PhD research student at the University of Sunderland. My research area is cybersecurity, predominantly how we communicate cybersecurity and raise awareness of that within businesses and people.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. And so, Claire, can you bring, I think, all speakers onto the screen, if that's possible? Sharon, are you going to ask the questions, or am I?
You're going to ask the questions.
Oh, right. glad I wrote some down. Well, let's start with you then, Sharon. I know you've done a lot of work in research into why some of this just doesn't stick with SMEs. Yeah, and the sort of what more could they do? What more should they be doing?
I think the issue is it's a multifaceted problem, which goes beyond just simply what can an SME do, but what can we do, for example, as a university to help raise awareness with the general public and with SMEs, but also how the media actually talks about fraud and cybersecurity issues. I was really interested in Paddy's presentation and about shifting the language about fraud from scams to abuse, because you're right, it's often seen to be a victimless crime, and the way that the media talks about fraud and cybersecurity often seems to cast the victim as, you know, the role of someone who is perhaps naive or easily led, or, you know, has fallen for something that your everyday person wouldn't necessarily fall for. And I think what we need to do is think, how do we present narrative stories and examples to the public and to SMEs that are relevant and that actually do communicate the risks out there, the consequences, but that link this to some form of action. It's all right to say to somebody, you know, you need to protect yourself, but you've got to then arm them with the knowledge to be able to follow through. And I think that's really where, at the moment, there is a huge gap and a huge potential for us to act and really have an impact in terms of how the public protect themselves, in terms of how businesses protect themselves. And I think, you know, there's a role for the media in that as well.
Yeah, but good news doesn't sell papers, does it? It's
no,
much easier.
It doesn't. But you can still portray bad news, but not in a way that trivialises the victim. And I think that's the problem here. If you talk to people who have fallen victim to some form of fraud abuse, they often feel quite embarrassed because they think, oh gosh, I shouldn't have fallen for that. Well, actually, these scams, and I agree with Paddy, don't really like that word. They're extremely sophisticated, and, you know, being taken advantage of in that way isn't necessarily something you're personally responsible for. And I just think the way that the media portrays these crimes should be looked at, because when people think about fraud and when people think about cybersecurity, they use a range of cognitive heuristics in order to draw to their minds examples. And these examples typically come from the media. And if those examples are not relevant to them or relatable to their situations, it's then very easy for people to discount and think, well, actually, I'm not like that person. This won't happen to me. Therefore, my need to act is somewhat reduced. And then it ends up being delayed and it doesn't happen.
That's a very good point. I noticed this morning that I was on Twitter, somebody connected to me who was a scam ambassador from Cleveland Police. So that's a new one on me, but I think it's an interesting role, and I intend to go and try and talk to her as soon as Cyberfest is over. But do you think there's an argument for people being more open about the frauds that are attempted on them or made to them, and then people realizing that actually this is happening to everybody, and there is little shame in it? It's a constant problem. Do you think that's an issue that we need to address?
Yeah, I think we absolutely need to address that and be more open about this. Just before we came on here, Dominc and I were discussing some personal experiences of fraud, and people that we know who are actually extremely technically savvy, who have been caught out by some really sophisticated frauds and feel highly embarrassed about it. But it happens to the best of us. It happens to all of us. And I think we need to change the dialogue and the language as to how we discuss these issues if we're ever going to move forward and help people to protect themselves.
Okay, and that's really interesting, because I think I'm starting to see a few more people on social media who work in the business saying, look, I've been caught by this. There's no shame in it. You need to be aware. And I think more and more of that is really good. But Sharon, my last question for you for this time is, for the moment, is: are businesses still sticking their head in the sand over this issue?
Yes. So we're about to publish some research that we've conducted over the last year with small to medium-sized businesses across the country. And what we did within that research was to ask them to make some self-assessments of their vulnerability to cybercrime. And the resounding result was that businesses, particularly at the smaller end of the continuum, felt that they were invisible and showed a lack of understanding as to how cyber criminals operate, thinking that actually targets are going to be bigger brands, people with greater turnovers, and not just realising that actually this is an opportunistic crime. And in many respects, if you're connected to the internet, then you are vulnerable. But I think the other thing that came across from that research was not only are some businesses in the majority of our sample reporting underestimates or very optimistic assessments of their vulnerability, they're telling us that what they need is supported action. So it's fine saying, we need to take regular backups, or we need to protect ourselves against malware infection. But if you're running a business and it's a small business, you're often wearing many hats, and you don't necessarily have the technical expertise to be able to manage some of these things. Or it may be that because cybersecurity is quite a complex area, that you believe that actually you won't be able to do it. And that's simply not the case. So what businesses were telling us is, great, yes, we see the awareness campaigns, but we need help. We need targeted support to help us achieve those things that will protect us. So I think that's where the gap is. It's moving from telling people what to do to actually giving them the skills and the knowledge to be able to do it.
Yeah, I agree. And the support and help is out there, and I think we just need to find a better way to engage.
Exactly.
And I must remember not to ask closed questions. We'll come to you, Dominc. I know that you and I have only quite a bit of time. That's great. I love the camera work here. That's good. You're heavily involved in the learning system, as it were, both being as a student and now moving on PhD, etc., etc. Do young people get this? Do they understand the threat of cybersecurity, do you think, or the threat from lack of cybersecurity?
It's an interesting one, because I think that the general perception is obviously the older generation are more susceptible, the younger generation are going to be more knowledgeable. And I can't remember the study now off the top of my head, but I think there's some recent stuff that's come out to show that actually it's the younger generation that's typically fallen towards more fraud.
I knew it. I knew it. I knew it.
and the thing with that is it because we're in this digital age, you know, a lot of these, say, fraudsters who grew up in this digital age, they know the target audience they're going for now. And like we were saying earlier on there around falling for scams and things like that, I'm a cybersecurity expert, you know, and I double think everything I do now online. If I get a thing through PayPal, I'm thinking, is that PayPal? Is it a scam? Is it not? I don't know. So I think the scams are just progressing to the point where it is really hard to detect. Are young people more aware? No, I don't think we are. At the end of the day, I don't think we are. I think we're more confident than we think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think confidence comes with youth. But my understanding of biology is that young people become old people, and all old people were young people once. And so, is there more, do you think, that the learning system needs to do in order to encourage good behaviours?
Definitely. I think if you look at, say, a STEM subject within Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, it's predominantly looking at, say, bullying and abuse and things like that, and how to report it. It's not really looking at how do you spot a scam, or even how do you really defend yourself against the scam, if that makes any sense. We said earlier on there about the open source tools that's out there to make, say, a phishing email or a phishing scam, like you can make it within a minute or something like that. I think there needs to be more at a school level to show kids how to code, how to detect these attacks, and how to defend them, because really, if you think about it, cybersecurity is so ingrained in everything we do every day. You know, we're going more digital as time goes on. Kids are getting through primary school, secondary school, and then the only way you get cybersecurity education is when you come to college and university, and I think that's too late. Yeah,
in many ways, it should be like road safety, or stranger awareness, and that kind of thing, which these are messages that we have to keep to young people all the time. And I think it's just because of its newness, it's taking time to embed in it. Okay. And so how have you found awareness, Dominic, of cybersecurity issues as you pass through the education? Is it growing, or is it stagnant, or is it laissez-faire?
I think it's grown. Definitely think it's grown. I think cybersecurity is still a buzzword. If you see the word cyber, I think people switch off instantly. So with me, it was more, I'm online quite a lot. I'm plugged in, if you would say it, you know what I mean? So I spot things like that, but obviously coming through the university, reading research papers that's coming out, etc., is fantastic. But I think one thing that would definitely boost my knowledge and definitely boost other people's knowledge is getting out in the industry. Because it's one of those things where you learn to drive, you pass your driving test, you know, and say, all right, you pass your driving test, now you're really going to learn how to drive. It's all right, come to university and learn it. You need to get out there in the industry, and you really need to pick up that sort of knowledge and see what's going on out there. It's all right sitting in sort of glass house.
Oh, that's great. And really good answer, especially since I've got cyber behind me all over the place. But there is a big language issue. Okay, my next question, I'm going to ask Paddy and then Jonny, if you don't mind. By the time, Paddy, once the police get involved or the lawyers get involved, it's kind of too late, isn't it? What more should the police or the public be doing to try and head these off at the pass rather than rely upon law enforcement?
I wouldn't say it's too late, but what I would say is that this is a really, really large threat area, and it's very wide. It touches, if we think of cyber and we think of digital simply in our day-to-day lives, it impacts everything that we touch. So therefore, there is the ability that all of those aspects are opened up to abuse, and they're opened up to bad actors who want to twist it for their own means. So the response is one that we need to have as a society. So when we're talking about, you know, the cyber threats and things like that, even if you just look at it from a fraud side of it, and you don't open up things like DDoS attacks or malware attacks and things like that. You look at the whole remit of emotions that are targeted through fraud, whether that be romance fraud and people who are looking for love. And, you know, I know someone in the Northeast who's currently setting up a dating platform that is more secure so that people are better protected, because they don't think that the normal websites out there give that adequate level of protection. Now, you can look at that across every industry, every sector, and go, what more can we do? You know, when we look at entrepreneurship and, you know, SMEs that are starting up, that ethical grounding to do the right thing, to look at how they can benefit society, because this is a threat that everyone faces, is something that we actually need to really embed right across sort of everyday life. Then we get into the other angles of how things can be dealt with. So yes, there is the investigation side of it with policing. And every time that we look at an investigation, why did that one happen? Getting those good feedback loops created so that we understand what the opportunity was that those criminals exploited at that time, and then feeding that information back in so that hopefully, you know, we can safeguard people in the future, and hopefully the people who are responsible can be brought to justice, and, you know, we can stop them making more victims out of the public and out of the communities. But also we need to look at, you know, what are we doing in relation to the people who might be brought into that type of criminal lifestyle, the people who are recruited into these criminal gangs. You know, can we divert them from those paths and give them other opportunities that aren't part of the sort of criminal lifestyle? There's lots and lots of different avenues, and we actually need a whole lot of help from everyone across society in these different sectors to try and make an impact.
You're absolutely right, because whenever I get, whenever the police are involved in an event like this, I think it always adds a kudos, a level of sort of support to the arguments that we're putting. People take note of when the police are involved, but you must be spread extremely thinly. How do we use all the resource that you've got within the police to bring to bear upon this problem?
Well, within the police, it's about trying to modernize our responses anyway. You know, the environment that we find ourselves in has accelerated very, very quickly. So if we just think of it as sort of modern life, and how difficult would the pandemic in the last 18 months have been if that had happened 2 years earlier or 3 years earlier, where we didn't have those technological advancements. Now, like anything, it tends to be the big companies with lots of money that can accelerate and bring things to market quicker. The public service isn't one of those big companies as much as we'd like to be. So there is a lag. There is a need to catch up from the police's point of view to raise awareness, not only within the organisation and the opportunities that exist out there, whether that be tech or elsewhere where systems we can bring in, but also training staff in the same way that anyone else will. Some of that comes through the natural, you know, bringing through young people. When I joined the police and I was sent out to a crime scene, they talked about things like golden hour opportunities. And I'm going back 17 years now. Your golden hour opportunities were talking to witnesses who might have been next door. They were looking for an overt CCTV camera, which was probably only on the shop at the end of the street. And now you have an 18-year-old cop or 19-year-old cop who's just joined the job. It's natural for them to walk in and go, oh, there's a Ring doorbell that uploads to the cloud. There's a wireless dash cam in the vehicle that's gone outside. There's, you know, a CCTV system on 7 of the houses in that street. It's everywhere that we see. And some of it is just about changing people's perceptions, and people who've done the job, who are very, very good at the job, but going, you've got to understand the benefits that modern day life has provided us, and that added evidence that can capture when we're looking at that prosecution side of policing.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Paddy. I could talk to you all day, but I'd like to bring up Jonny, if you don't mind, and I just kind of similar question, without giving too much away, Jonny. Is there some things that you wish your clients would do better, or the wish that businesses would do better to head off some of these issues?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as you've identified, and Peter and I get involved when things have gone wrong. So I completely agree with the statement made by somebody earlier that the focus should be on prevention, not cure. I think for businesses, there's investment is a way of trying to prevent these things from happening. But I do think that education is critical as well. So I think in terms of focusing on the prevention, it's a mixture of investment and education. I think in terms of what would I like my clients to do better? I think because when they come to Peter and I, kind of the horse is already bolted. The main thing from our perspective is the earlier you come to us, the more we can do to help you. So from a prevention, from a kind of after the event perspective, then the sooner we can get involved and start to help clients to create that robust paper trail that the regulator is going to want to see, to help them to cloak certain discussions in privilege, so they have that safe space to make decisions that aren't going, that things aren't going to come back to bite them. Things like that is from our perspective what I'd like to see. And as a comment that one of my colleagues made when I was talking about this today, talking about this session today with them, is that you look at, from a regulatory perspective, the ICO, as you said before, Phil, this is quite a new area. It's quite a growth area. And when you compare it to a more mature regulatory regime like a health and safety executive, so we have lots of manufacturing clients, they know exactly what to do if there's a health and safety incident, somebody gets injured at work. They've got a plan. It's almost like clockwork because it's a mature regulatory regime and it's well established. That isn't the same thing from a cyber perspective. And so kind of one piece of advice from me would be for companies to kind of battle game and work out, if we are the victim of something, what are we going to do? What's our plan? Who are we going to call? The lawyers, the technical experts, will our insurer step in and take or give us some help? So it's thinking about planning for the worst, I think. Yeah,
I agree with you. Perhaps more upstream in terms of think of these things earlier and think of the possible outcomes. And it is a real risk. But you've led me nicely into a question I'd like to ask Peter. And that is to do with the ICO. It's fundamentally involved in this regime in terms of governance and management of the problem. Got a change in the commissioner coming up. There's rumour that it's going to be, I think it's a guy, Mr. Edwards, formerly of New Zealand. Is there an opportunity here to give the ICO a bit more teeth?
Yes, so I think he was confirmed yesterday or the day before.
Well, I'm probably behind it.
So he's yes, potentially. I mean, what Oliver Dowden, the now former minister, said when it was announced that he was the favoured candidate was that it would be an opportunity both to improve the protection of people's privacy rights, but also to help businesses take advantage of data. Now, those two things, I'm not entirely convinced necessarily work together, because you can't open things up to allow business to do certain things without impacting on rights. So it will be interesting to see. From what we know of the incoming Information Commissioner, that they were the equivalent of the Information Commissioner in New Zealand. And while they were there, they took a pretty strong stance in relation to tech companies, for example. So in the terrorist incident, in the wake of the terrorist incidents there, where there was live streaming of the events on, I think it was Facebook, he took a pretty hardline approach in terms of that, and in terms of regulating tech companies. So I can't help but think that'll be one of the things that the government will be looking for the ICO to be pushing forward. But equally, there's been a lot of talk recently from the government, and there's a consultation out from the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport at the moment. And it's a very large document, I think about 150 pages, which is considering different ways in which we can change our data privacy regime. And there's an awful lot of stuff in there that is quite clearly designed to be a bit more business friendly. So I'm not entirely sure that the government's got clear priorities there about what they want the ICO to actually achieve. I suppose we'll have to see what the new commissioner says when they come in. I think it's at the end of October.
Excellent, thank you. So it's an interesting times ahead. Okay, so I'm just going to come back to you, Sharon, and if that's okay. And so what would you like to, having done all this work in terms of understanding where businesses are at, what would you like to see them do more of?
I think going back to first principles and being able to make informed risk assessments of where they are in their cybersecurity journey and the specific things that they need to do. It's like, you know, when you go to buy a car, you could get your base model, which will get you from A to B, and then you can get your souped up model that will get you from A to B faster and in more comfort and greater style, but you don't necessarily need that. And I think in terms of being able to make accurate assessments of where people are and then work out what's the next step that'll just get me to be protected, and then where do I move from there, and really thinking that this is actually a journey, because criminals are getting more and more sophisticated all the time. The nature of attacks are changing all the time, and you can't just say I'm protected. You've got to engage in this continuous development. So I think better risk assessments and better support from government, universities as well, to help people understand their risks adequately, and then work out just what's the next step, because the thing that often puts people off is the huge costs involved when they're paying for cybersecurity advice and products.
But that needn't be the case. Not all is expensive, is it?
No, I mean, there's plenty of help out there, and plenty of that help and support is free. But the problem is, and certainly from the work that we've done, a number of businesses have some trust issues and concerns that because they don't necessarily understand the full gamut of cybersecurity language and preventative measures, that when you're starting at a position of low knowledge, it's easier to end up paying for or buying more than you actually need.
Yes, but of course the irony is that it'll cost you an awful lot more when you are hit.
Yes, exactly, and that's, yeah, exactly.
But I think you're touching on a very interesting point there about trust, and I guess that cybersecurity is an industry that, or the threat is an industry that relies upon lack of trust. Yeah, it's an untrustworthy attack, and so it's quite difficult to raise trust. So I think we need to do much more in that area. Which brings me nicely back to Dominc, and what more would you like to see young people doing in order to become wiser in terms of the threat that's out there?
I think it's linking back to really what Sharon said there, and Jonny was saying as well. Within cybersecurity, you've almost got to be sort of like a fortune teller, if that makes any sense. You've got to try and keep yourself ahead of it. And it links into a quote, funnily enough, by another lawyer, Cicero. I am ignorant of what I do not know. And I think that is massively applicable to cybersecurity. I think a lot of organisations just think, don't know about cybersecurity, or a lot of young people, for example, don't know about cybersecurity, that's someone else's job, they can deal with that, I'll be protected. So I would genuinely love to see more sort of, especially in schools and within universities maybe, hacking clubs, for example, learn how to both pen test and defend against that, or just have more of a open society to speak and talk. And I think that's something that would branch over not just young people, but in the business as well, and in the general public. Sharing. We need to have trust, we need to be able to share. You know, the NTSC in their National Cybersecurity Strategy back in 2016 noted that one of their main strategies was to share information, and no one's sharing. So why we're not sharing? So I'd like to see more of an approach towards an openness, if that makes any sense. A trust to just a platform to share basically information to each other.
Yeah, I suspect that people think that if they share that it makes it more vulnerable, but actually it's the opposite. But Dominic, you were straying into Donald Rumsfeld territory there with the unknown knowns and that kind of thing. So I think that's probably the best place to stop in terms of this conversation. But if all of you could just hang around, because Caroline will be coming back shortly to talk about the ethics of action or inaction around what we're trying to do here. But can I ask Claire then to bring up our next speaker, Elizabeth Gardiner from Protect, who's going to talk about, does a whistleblowing policy help cybersecurity and fraud prevention? Are you there, Elizabeth?
Hello, yes, I'm here. I need the host to unblock my video and then I can see you all. Great.
Claire, unblock the video.
There we go. Hi, and thank you so much for inviting me today. And it's actually a really good place to start because just picking up on Dominic's last point about trust and people speaking up, it couldn't be a better lead in to my talk today. So I'm Liz Gardiner, I'm the Chief Exec of Protect, and we are the UK's whistleblowing charity. And I've been asked to talk today about whether a whistleblowing policy can help prevent fraud and cybersecurity. And that's you know, a really important issue that a lot of your speakers have been talking about just now, because I'm very aware that cybercrime is one of the most disruptive frauds that an organisation can face. We've heard from Paddy about the really frightening statistics and from Sharon about how it could affect all of us. And I think the impact and the repercussions for business when it goes wrong, our lawyers have made it very clear. Those are things that we actually want to prevent. So I've got a little slideshow, which I will bring up. And hopefully, I hope you can see that. Let me know if you can't. So the question, does a whistleblowing policy help? Can you see that, Phil? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Well, my rather straightforward answer is, well, of course, a policy doesn't do very much, does it? You just put it in a drawer and you've got a policy. It's not going to help anybody, is it? But less flippantly, it's a start. It's the very first building block in building a speak-up culture that allows you to minimise fraud and ensure your organisation is protected as well as it can, particularly from the insider threat, as well as the outsider threat that we've been very much focusing on today. And of course, having a policy is more than a great many employers do have. If you're in a regulated sector like the Financial Conduct Authority or within the health service, you may have very strict requirements on what you do have to provide for a policy. But most employers don't have any requirements at all. So my talk today is going to be very much around why whistleblowing is important and how a policy and more, how effective whistleblowing arrangements can support your battle against cybercrime and fraud. But just before I start, just a little bit of an introduction to who we are at Protect. We've been operating as a whistleblowing charity since 1993, 5 years before the Public Interest Disclosure Act was established, which sets out the whistleblowing law and employment rights in the UK in this area. And we were started because there was a series of public disasters, from the Clapham rail crash. Some of you older than me will remember the Herald of Free Enterprise ferry disaster. And what we'd found was that all the major disasters that happened, all the scandals that needed investigation, they were all saying the same thing, that somebody inside the organisation knew that something was wrong, but they were either too frightened to speak up, or they spoke up to the wrong person, or they spoke up and they were ignored. And today we still see that significance of what whistleblowing could and should be. We only have to look to the whistleblower, Dr. Lei Wen-Liang. You know, if only the world had listened to him when he was raising concerns about a new virus in Wuhan, we might be in a very different place today. So what we do at Protect is we have these three legs to our stool, as it were. So we provide free confidential advice to any individual in the workplace who doesn't know whether or how to raise their concerns. And we advise around 3,000 callers a year. And we've advised over 45,000 in our history. We also support organisations. We provide training, consultancy, and we develop best practice in whistleblowing arrangements. And finally, we campaign for improvements in public policy and the law and we have a current campaign to bring whistleblowing law up to date to make sure that we don't fall behind our neighbours in Europe, where a new whistleblowing directive is being introduced. And just to make sure that we are all on the same page, here's our definition of whistleblowing. It doesn't actually sit anywhere in the law, but our definition is about a worker who's raising a concern about wrongdoing, risk or malpractice that affects others with someone in authority. And that might be internally, so raising a concern with their employer, or externally. And I think there's some common misconceptions around whistleblowing, that it only happens when it's gone outside the employer. But in fact, if you're raising a concern about a breach of a legal obligation or health and safety or a crime like fraud inside your organisation to your employer, that's whistleblowing too, and that's where the law will protect you. There's no mention in our definition of seriousness either, and I think it's really important that whistleblowing is also considered as a fairly ordinary thing to do, to raise a concern, to speak up, to have the confidence and trust in your organisation that you can say something when you see wrongdoing. It shouldn't just be the very, very big risks that are clearly going to fall within that sort of fraud category. And the risk bit is important too, because it's not just the harms that have materialised, but also that piece that we've been talking about today about prevention. You know, I've spotted something going wrong. There's a risk that we might have a cybersecurity issue if we don't do something. That should also be something we're able to whistleblow about. The person who's raising it has to be a worker. So we're talking about people raising concerns inside the organisation, not members of the public. And other organisations will use other terms like speaking up and raising concerns interchangeably with whistleblowing. But I thought that would just be helpful just to set the scene about what we think we're talking about here. And why is it important? In our view at Protect, whistleblowing is demonstrably good for business. Having a right culture in place in an organisation will help your staff raise concerns. It will also deter other staff from wrongdoing if they know they're going to be held to account for it. It can detect wrongdoing early, and that's so important in this area of fraud and cyber risk, that you pick up an incident, as Jonny and Peter were saying earlier, you know, before it becomes a damaging issue for your organisation. That we're looking at prevention as well as the after the events issues. And whistleblowing can protect lives, as we've seen in the NHS, livelihoods, reputation, finances, and I would add to that the regulatory intervention that of good governance, and in demonstrating that you're holding your accountable organisation to your staff, to your shareholders, to your clients, to the public. And as organisations, there's very much an emphasis at the moment on the ESG, to demonstrate your environmental, social and governance credibility as businesses, and I think it absolutely plays to that. And of course, golden thread is that whistleblowing is about protecting the public interest. All of the concerns about whistleblowing are not about private individuals' issues, but about the public interest that we're trying to prevent harm. And in terms of the fraud prevention piece, these stats are from the PwC's Global Economic Crime Survey of 2020. And that revealed that fraud and economic crime are at record highs in the UK, and the Financial Conduct Authority and others have said it's not got any better thanks to the coronavirus. In fact, there are new risks that have come about since the pandemic started. And although 57% of frauds are external, 24% are committed by people who are inside the organisation, and a further 17% are a collusion between people inside and outside. And the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners report to the Nations found that 43% of all fraud is detected by tip-offs. And of those, 50% of those are from employees. And that compares with only 15% of fraud that's detected by internal audit arrangements. And organisations who have got a strong code of conduct and good ethical arrangements can reduce the time it takes them to detect fraud by up to 50%, down from 24 months to just 12. So why do we need a whistleblowing policy? what's this got to do with fraud prevention anyway? Haven't we got all our anti-bribery, anti-corruption, what to do with fraud policies in place? Well, hopefully yes, but what more can whistleblowing do for you? And there's many reasons why I think people might not choose to pick up your anti-bribery, money laundering, corruption policies as a first place. The first thing, they might be not sure. Does what I've seen going wrong in my department actually meet that definition of fraud? We've heard earlier today how complex some of these cyber scams and other issues can be, and how it can affect anybody, and we can all fall foul of it. So when people are not sure what they've seen, is it a fraud? They may not want to jump straight in with 2 feet to alerting your anti-money laundering and going to the fraud prevention piece. They might want to raise it as a concern. And I'm sure that what we're talking about today, all the organisations in this space want to encourage people to talk about concerns and risks rather than certainties when something's gone wrong. Although, of course, you want to hear about that too. But a much bigger reason might be that, I'm trying to get my next. Much bigger reason might be that your employees are fearful. The fraud might be being conducted in your organisation by somebody much higher up, somebody who controls their future in the company. And they're worried, as many whistleblowers are, that they're going to be treated badly or dismissed if they start raising concerns. They might be concerned that if they go straight to the fraud or to the police or to somebody else, that they've got no protection of confidentiality. And your whistleblowing policy should give them some assurances. Of course, when it becomes a major issue, if it has to be handed to the police, if there has to be an investigation, there are some limits to that confidentiality. But the first thing they might be worried about is, if I put my head above the parapet, everybody's going to know it's me that talked about this. And that's going to make my career here impossible. But we also hear from whistleblowers that there are 2 real fears. One for themselves, that they won't be listened to, and one for themselves, that they won't be treated well, but secondly, that when they raise their concerns, they're not going to be listened to. And that's why having a whistleblowing policy in place can be really important in setting the tone for an organisation about what it is you want to hear from your organisation about, and giving people confidence and trust that even if you're wrong, even if you're mistaken, we're going to have a look at what you've told us, and we'll feed back to you and let you know whether what the next steps are. I think those are really important things for people to bear in mind. So what makes a good policy? Well, the first issue is about leadership. The tone from the top is really important. We've learned over the years that you need senior buy-in for whistleblowing to work. Whether you have a member of your board or a senior executive who takes overall responsibility and shows that you think whistleblowing is serious. Your policy needs to be written for the silent majority. You need to be telling people there's a safe alternative in your organisation to silence. It should be easily understandable by everybody across the organisation. You also need to set out clearly in a policy what you mean by open, confidential and anonymous raising of concerns. So when we're talking about open concerns, you might just go and say, talk to your line manager and say, I don't think there's something's right here, and I think you want to look into it. You're just passing on the information openly. You don't have any worries about what they're going to do with it. You've just passed that on. But a lot of whistleblowers are worried about what will happen to them, and depending on what they're raising and who they're raising concerns about, they might want the protection of confidentiality. So you'll want to set out in your policy how you go about protecting the confidentiality as far as you possibly can, and explaining that there will sometimes be limits on that, particularly when we're dealing with issues of fraud where they spill into that area of, yes, we're now convinced this is a potential crime. We have to hand in police. We cannot carry on protecting your confidentiality, but we're going to come back and tell you before we give your name to anybody else. And we're still going to keep that on a need-to-know basis as far as we possibly can. But you might also want to be talking about whether you're interested in hearing from anonymous whistleblowers. If you haven't got to that place yet where people are confident that you've got an honest, trusted, open conversation, you might still want to hear about the risks anonymously so that you get that forewarning, the first chance to to tackle something before it becomes a major concern. You also need to distinguish in your policy the difference between whistleblowing and personal grievances. So whistleblowing, as I said, is about concerns that affect others. You're raising a matter of public interest concern. It's not about those private employment rights, I haven't been paid properly, or I'm being bullied by my manager. That's quite rightly in the category of grievance. Of course, there's a little grey area there as well, because I'm being bullied, but everybody in my team is also being bullied. That might be a cultural problem that tips more into the whistleblowing. So it's not always clear cut, but I think you need to distinguish as far as you can. Whistleblowing is about things that are affecting others, about the wider organisation or group within the organisation, and that it's in the public interest to get these issues raised. You need to provide people both internal and external options to raise concerns. So internally, you need a system, somebody that they can go to other than their line manager. Small organisations, that might be just one or two other people. Larger organisations will have whole whistleblowing teams that can address concerns. And also set out the external options. You know, if you don't want to come to us because you're frightened, you might want to go to the regulator. And actually, some of these really serious existential risks, that some of the cyber security risks and so forth, you might actually prefer that somebody went to the regulator than you never heard at all until all the harm had been done and the organisation had been damaged to the extreme that it could be. So sometimes actually you might have the confidence of saying, we do want you to go to the regulator or to somebody external if you don't feel you can raise it with us internally. But you can also give people external options like coming to Protect for a bit more advice. If you're not sure, is it a concern or how to raise it, you know, here are some other options, whether it's your trade union or somebody else, or indeed Protect for advice. You should also set out really clearly what you expect your managers to do when they receive a whistleblowing concern. So what assurances can they give to staff about confidentiality? What's going to happen next? Who's going to investigate? What the feedback loop is going to be. And if you expect your managers to record these kind of incidents, when they're going to pass that up the chain and what they're going to record. And finally, you need to think about who is your policy covering. Now, the law says that whistleblowing rights are afforded to workers, and there's a slightly wider definition of worker in the law than in other areas, but it doesn't include self-employed, genuinely self-employed contractors, and it doesn't include your suppliers and people that you work with. That doesn't mean your policy can't include those people. You know, we've heard that 57% of fraud is committed by outsiders. So it might be that somebody in your external supply chain is the first to see when something's going wrong, or could tip you off that there's a potential fraud down the line. So you might want your policy to apply even more widely than just your individual staff. But as I said at the start, having a policy in place is just the very first building block. How you communicate that with your team is vital. And here, leadership and tone from the top again is really important, especially during these sort of hybrid working COVID times. It's really important that senior managers and those responsible for whistleblowing are visibly engaged with the issue. So think about when they can communicate that, not just a one-off, here's a policy, go and do a bit of training. It's a continual process, reminding staff about what they want to hear, that you want to hear, whether that's in staff meetings, one-to-one, through your bulletins, through posters when we're back at work. And you need to train all staff about how to raise a concern, and you need to separately train managers on how to receive and handle concerns. Because our research shows that most whistleblowers are not persistent. They'll raise their concern once. So you've got this really small window to get it right as an organisation, to say, I'll take that seriously, I'll investigate that. Thank you for raising that with me. And if the whistleblower gets a brush off from the manager, or, you know, doesn't hear the right response, the answer might not be that they raise it with somebody else. It might be that you go silent and you miss that opportunity to address the risk while it's still a risk and not a really major harm. And engagement's really important. So that feedback loop is important to whistleblowers. Once if you are investigating, let the whistleblower know how long it's going to take, when you can feedback and what you can feedback. There are obviously confidentiality pieces, difficulties there around breaching other people's confidentiality and some issues around that. But as far as you can, feasibly and reasonably feeding back what happened as a result of somebody raising concern. We looked into it, we investigated it, we couldn't find any substance to it, but we're really grateful for you for raising your concern, and the door's always open if you want to come back and you have any further concerns in the same area. Those kind of things can really make a difference in your organisation to whether, to contrast that with a whistleblower who raises something, I never heard anything, there wasn't any point, nobody did anything, I'm not going to bother next time. And they tell all their colleagues the same story. So there's a really important feedback loop and engagement. And finally, how do you know that your arrangements are working? Are you auditing? Are you reviewing them? Are you making sure constantly that that communication training is going on and that your staff believe you when you say that you want to hear them speak up? So at Protect, we've developed a benchmark which absolutely helps organisations assess their whistleblowing arrangements, because we were so often asked by employers, well, what's a good number of concerns? You know, I'm an organisation of 100 staff. How many whistleblowing concerns should I be having a year? I've got 6,000 staff or 6 million staff across the world. How many whistleblowing concerns is the right number? And for us, that's the wrong question, because an organisation that hears a lot of concerns might have a very good open speak up culture, and that's all very encouraging. It might mean that there's an awful lot going wrong. And conversely, not hearing having very few whistleblowing concerns in a year could mean that everything's hunky-dory, and it could mean that your staff are really frightened to speak up. So it's not always the most, it's an important question to measure and monitor how many concerns you're receiving, but it's not the only measure. So we've adapted that and developed a qualitative approach in our whistleblowing benchmark, where we look at 34 standards in these 3 key areas. So in governance, we examine policies and procedures that you have in place. In the engagement piece, we look at your communications, the training that you do with staff, what testing you do to make sure that staff do have that confidence to use the arrangements. And in the operations, we look at what the journey of the whistleblower actually is. When they come to you, what is their experience going through that process? So if anybody is interested in finding out where they are on their whistleblowing journey, we can provide you the benchmark which you can complete yourself, or we can provide you some comparative data so that you can see where you are in organisations of your size and in your sector, or we can do an independent verification. So our experts in Protect will also look at all the information that you have around your whistleblowing, and we will do a gap analysis and say where we think that there could be recommendations for improvement. So I hope I've convinced you a little bit today that whistleblowing is an important tool. It's a tool that you can use to help you in that fraud prevention and cybersecurity. And if you're interested in learning more about it, I'll be very happy to have an email or a call either to me or to my business support team. My details are there, and I'm also very happy to take any questions. Thanks very much.
Elizabeth, that was great. Thank you very much. A lot to think about, and really shows to me that whistleblowing should be part of your governance regime. It should be led from the top and be part of your risk management process that goes on. So how do, I can understand how larger businesses can accommodate this within their arrangements that they have, but how do small businesses, micro businesses, say 5 to 10 employees, how do they manage this? Because in many ways, they're much more family-like than
yeah. And sometimes that means that the concerns can easily be discussed. But on the other hand, it can also mean, and we saw a lot of this when we were dealing with furlough leave fraud. A lot of times, a very small business with no whistleblowing arrangements in place, it means that the employees don't have anywhere to go internally, and therefore they are much more likely to go to the regulator. So at Protect, we're quite small. We're less than 20. Big, but we actually have a contractual clause that talks about our belief in speaking up. Everybody gets a whistleblowing policy when they join, and we do training and so forth. You'd expect that of us. But even for the smallest organisation, one of my team came up with an 8-word policy. You know, speak up, we'll listen, we'll act, and we'll protect. And that's the message that we need to get people thinking about. For small organisations, of course, you don't need huge whistleblowing arrangements. You don't even probably need, you know, lengthy policies that but what you need is that really core message to get people speaking up, that trust and confidence in the organisation. And however small you are, you can identify one person in the organisation who takes responsibility for this and understands whistleblowing a little bit more and what they need to do to give the assurances to create that culture of speaking up.
So my skewed notion of this sometimes with this is that there is a lot of fear in around whistleblowing, that people when confronted with an issue, their hackles go up, their defences go up, and well, this can't be happening in my organisation. What can we do then to soften that blow and get people to just take that step back and think that this could be a genuine concern rather than an accusation of something going wrong in my organisation?
That's right, and that's one of the things that we do on our advice line, is help people articulate those concerns in ways that, you know, whistleblowers, you know, they're not presenting a problem, they're actually trying to help the business. And I think, you know, going back to my slide on business benefits, there's an increasing body of evidence that says whistleblowing is good for business, and listening to those concerns will allow, you know, they're the cheapest, whistleblowers are your cheapest, best form of risk assessment. They're the closest to the concern, they're the eyes and ears of the organisation. So let's start, you know, thinking of whistleblowers as good for business and not troublemakers and so forth. And I think the other thing is, you know, that idea that whistleblowing isn't those people who go to the Daily Mail with the concern. That isn't whistleblowing. Well, it is whistleblowing, but it isn't all what whistleblowing is about. Whistleblowing is also those everyday conversations that you're having with your manager that's saying something doesn't look right. You know, I'm not an expert in fraud. I don't think I would always recognise that an accounting issue, you know, was potentially a fraudulent one, but I might be able to say that isn't what we did last time, and I don't really understand where these figures have come from. And you know, that kind of, if I express that in the right way, I could also be protected as a whistleblower and say, look, I think, you know, there's a breach here. I suspect something's going wrong, and here's the information I'm giving you as an employer. And employers need to think of that as a gift of information. You know, it's a gift that the whistleblower is giving to them, a chance to stop something before it becomes a really major harm. Stop it early.
And very much practice what they're preaching, I suppose. I mean, I was encouraged by that statistic that 43% of fraud is identified by, if I got that right, is identified by whistleblowers. So there's definitely investment, yeah. And okay, so we talked earlier on within, I think it was with Sharon, we were talking about the bad press. Good news doesn't sell newspapers, and I read in the press, when I do read the newspapers, that, you know, of cases where whistleblowing has gone wrong and people have been hounded out of organisations. I'm thinking of the NHS here in terms of some stories. Is that just newspapers spinning it, or is there a much better story to tell here?
I think that's really hard, actually, and I think it's absolutely right. You know, the bad stories are the ones we always see, and there are some terrible things that happen to whistleblowers. You know, when it goes wrong, it goes horribly wrong. They lose their jobs, their livelihoods, and it's incredibly damaging to their mental health, you know, their financial health, physical health, everything. You know, it's a huge, when we treat whistleblowers badly in this country, we treat them often horrendously, and that's got to stop. And one of the things that we're trying to do at Protect is look at whether the law is just, it has got that balance right between putting a duty on employers and protecting employees. Because the way that we protect employees at the moment is we say there's an after the event remedy when things have gone wrong. So if you're treated badly, you can go off to tribunal and make a claim. And then we make it quite complex about all the hurdles that you've got to prove to get your claim. So we put a huge amount of emphasis on the individual whistleblower, and the stories that we see are when it's gone horribly wrong. What we want is for organisations to have a positive duty at the outset to prevent victimisation. And it's something we're campaigning for. Indeed, we've got a webinar ourselves on Monday where we're talking all about the legal duties and the standards that we should be imposing on employers. And that's very much in line with what's happening across Europe, because the new EU whistleblowing directive is saying, well, look, all organisations, certainly all of those above 50 staff, should put in place whistleblowing arrangements, and they should have a number of duties on them in order to make sure that whistleblowing just becomes part of the everyday practice in business.
Excellent. So the last comment really strays into ethical sort of approach, and we're going to have Caroline on, who's a colleague of mine in the North East Initiative on Business Ethics, so that'll be a great topic to talk about. So my final question to you, though, and I don't know whether you know this is taking place or not. Are there any systems being developed that allow people to report things anonymously? That's a way of it not sticking to them, technical systems, for example?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, there are a huge number of platforms and tools for reporting whistleblowing that employers can use, so that you can now have a conversation with whistleblowers that is continuing. Because one of the problems with anonymous whistleblowing is you often just get a piece of information and you can't go back to the whistleblower to find out, well, yeah, that's really helpful, but if I just knew this, this and this, I could actually investigate. And while we'll always encourage our callers to speak to someone in confidence where they can, it's much better that somebody inside the organisation hears about it than nobody does. So some of the platforms that are available to organisations can allow that dialogue, so that somebody can remain anonymous but still have a conversation about whistleblowing with their employer or with their whistleblowing team at their employer. So yeah, I mean, a technology can really help here.
Yeah, I suppose that gets the whistleblower to a point where they realise the organisation is taking it seriously, and then feels comfortable enough to come out and
we hope so. Yeah, we hope so, because it's much more difficult than if things go wrong to protect somebody who's never had their name, who's never, if they're then dismissed, for them to prove that the reason for their dismissal was because they have been the whistleblower is much harder if the organisation can say we never knew who it was. So that's kind of why we encourage people to, where they can, raise it confidentially. But if employers are serious about hearing it, until we've got that lovely culture of trust where people can come forward confidentially or even openly, then maybe hearing it from people anonymously is better than not hearing at all, because silence isn't golden.
I perhaps should have mentioned the post office and the debacle with their IT systems and all that, which is an absolute nightmare for people. But thank you very much, Elizabeth. That's really good. If you could just hang around for the conversation, that I think Caroline's going to cover in a minute.
Thank
you. At this point, no, thank you. At this point, I promised you a discussion on can you ensure your way to good cybersecurity? And unfortunately, Andrew's not turned up. I haven't heard from him for a couple of days, so I hope everything's all right. But in the meantime, though, this is something that Jonny actually mentioned. Jonny, are you available just to have a quick chat about this?
Hello.
Oh, good. Right, I'm going to really put you on the spot, because you actually mentioned cyber insurance in your presentation. And how prevalent is this, and does it actually make a difference?
Yeah, it's very prevalent. It's on the rise. It does make a difference. So the case I mentioned, where the insurer stepped in, paid the ransom, and then took the lead on taking the action to get that back at no cost to the insured. So yeah, it's something that we're seeing more and more of. We as a firm work with lots of insurers, and lots of them have cyber policies. So yeah, definitely on the rise.
So do you find, though, that companies having cyber policies are already cybersecurity aware, or are they using it as a foil to avoid doing other things?
Well, I think, be careful what I say. As with most types of insurance, you need to do certain things in order to ensure that the policy remains valid. So it's not just a case of getting a policy and then not doing anything else, because you'll be able to rely on it. You have to, take steps to protect yourself. It's in addition to, rather than instead of, all the other good stuff that companies should be doing.
So really, you've answered the question that I was going to propose to Andrew. Can you ensure your way to good cybersecurity? No, really, you need good cybersecurity in order to get insurance to sort of...
That would be my view of it. Yes, I think it's not just something you can do and then forget about taking steps yourself. And of course, having an insurance policy against any liabilities that may flow isn't going to wash with the Information Commissioner either. So the policy helps you from your financial exposure to things. Whether it would apply to a fine for the ICO, I'm not sure. That would be one for Andrew. But yeah, I think the answer to that question, in my view, is not really.
Okay, that's great. So what you're saying to me, therefore, is cyber insurance isn't the silver bullet to solve all your problems. It's part of your general approach to a good cyber security governance.
I think so, yes.
Excellent. Right, well, that's great. You've just subsumed a 30-minute presentation. That's great. Excellent. Thanks so much, Jonny. Okay, next up is a long-time friend of mine, good friend of mine, Caroline Theobald, who were fellow directors of the North East Initiative on Business Ethics, and they are jointly sponsoring this event. Caroline, I think you're going to lead us on a discussion around the ethics of action or inaction on cybersecurity.
I am, and I'm very pleased, Phil, that I am a good. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
I'm very pleased I am a good friend of yours, because I could have fallen out with you. I think this is the most difficult question of the morning, if I'm perfectly honest. It's been a fantastic morning. I've learned lots and lots. But just before I get on to the meat of where I want to start asking people questions, it links back into what Jonny was just saying. In order to prep for today, apart from what I had in my head and I knew I'd learn from everybody who presented, so thank you so much everybody for that, I talked to 3 young members of my family, all who work in one way or another in cybersecurity. Mimi, who actually is talking next week, is a published student. Her work's been published on cybersecurity. Another one of my nieces works for Cisco. So that's the technical systems that perhaps can protect people, and as Liz has talked about, just to some of the anonymity thing in place. And the link with what Jonny has just said is that my nephew works for an insurance company in London called Atrium, and what he told me that with his clients, cyber, that of course you can get insurance for against cyber, but it's very expensive. So what Atrium have been doing is absolutely making sure that they have the systems in place to both make sure that if they suspect anything, any behaviour from dodgy, fraudulent behaviour from their clients, that has to be reported directly to the FCA, obviously. But in terms of the individuals who are working within the company who may be victims of phishing attacks from outsiders, they're tested, their integrity is tested, because the company itself sends phishing things to them to make sure that actually the firm is alerted. And there is my segue, because what Liz talked about, and I hope I can call you Liz, but you introduced yourself as Liz, so that's grand. What you talked about, Liz, was that instances are fraudulent, so instances of crime, going back to where we started, fraud, cyber fraud in general, it's not victimless, and it's a crime. What Liz talked about was that if you have a company that has good ethical arrangements, you are more likely to spot that crime in 12 months rather than 24. And I was quite interested in what she said, because I think it links directly back to British Airways, where the breach wasn't spotted for 24 months, as far as I understand it, and to Maersk, who came in before the incident that affected them happened before the 2018 Data Protection Act, and yet what the chief exec did was he went straight out there and said, we've been a victim of a breach. We're telling you all, can you help? And I was really interested in that, because I think that there is this Liz talked about leadership, and I think where you have really strong leadership like that, it really helps, or can really help. That sort of moral compass can really help, and shows the way for getting some of these things addressed. What you've asked me to ask our panel about is action or inaction. So I'm going to hold that Maersk example, and I'm going to then go almost to think about the legislation that Peter talked about, and the fact that the ICO, the Information Commission's office has now got far more teeth than it did, and is probably going to get more with the new commissioner. does that legislation actually mitigate against the ethics of action or inaction? Is regulation going to take its place, or is there still a real role out there for people to? Should we all be saying no, this is ethical, or can we now rely on the law and legislation to do that job for us? Jonny?
Thank you, I think, for coming to me first. It's a really interesting question, and I've been pondering on it as you've been talking there. I think that what the law does now is sets, as Peter described it, thresholds for reporting. So there's a threshold for reporting something to the ICO, and there's a higher threshold for alerting people whose data may have been affected. And so the law and some of the things that was part of our role is advising clients as to whether those thresholds have been met in a particular case and whether those obligations have been triggered. Now, I think it's a separate non-legal question as to whether a particular organization and the decision makers in that organization want to go further. So if the advice, for example, is the threshold to report to the ICO has been met, but the threshold to let the data subjects know hasn't been, so you do not have a legal obligation to do that, then there is a separate non-legal, so it's not something I would necessarily be a party to, but there is a scenario where businesses may take the view that, well, we don't have an obligation to do this, but we're going to do it anyway because we think there is a value in doing that, or a moral obligation, whatever the considerations are. But yes, I think my view of it is the law sets a standard, a threshold, and then there's a decision or some advice about whether that has been met in a particular case, and then if not, it becomes a decision for the affected organisation to make.
I'm very pleased you said that, because I'm now going to ask Peter a follow-up question. Peter, I may have heard you wrong, but I think you said that if the breach was only financial, i.e. internally financial, and didn't affect personal data, there wasn't a reporting obligation.
No, so the ICO is concerned with personal data in that respect. So if it was pure commercial information that didn't step over into the personal data of, whoever, whether that's employees or customers or business partners, if it didn't step over into that, it doesn't trigger any of those obligations at all. It's just about personal data, and it's treated with that extra level of importance because of the impact it can have for individuals. So, if it was your name and address that was out there, that has a level of harm. If it was your medical information, that has a great level of harm, or payment information, or what have you. For businesses, I suppose it's a level of risk that their confidential information goes out there, and that they need to protect that. But the harm for them is very much an economic one, whereas the harm for individuals, can be quite a bit more severe.
And that's very interesting, you see, because this links back to what Liz was saying about codes of conduct, because yes, this is then financial information as a tool of business, in the same way that if a machine went down and you were a manufacturing plant, then actually that would stop you delivering on time, which would have an economic impact. One of the things we've talked about this morning is trust. And actually, where I'm going with this a bit is, so even if this is a breach that just affects your internal systems, actually, is it the same as a machine breaking down or another bit of business activity, or should it be something that should be communicated with other people in terms of, this is a threat, this happened to us and this is what it looks like? And I'd be really interested, because I think an incident just as you're describing did happen in Newcastle to a company, and they kept it. They sorted it out. It didn't affect anybody else. You know, everything absolutely fine. Because of course the knock-on effect. You think about Maersk, you think about BA. The brand reputation here is absolutely critical. But thinking about what Dominc said, I think, and it's not Sue, is it? Forgive me. This thing about trust and how things trickle down to SMEs. How do we learn? How can we aggregate information if people are not sharing their stories? Who'd like to come in on that one?
So something I've heard anecdotally, so not conversations I've been a party to, but as I understand it, there's a concern about businesses talking about this type of thing because there's maybe a lack of a safe space to do it, and a worry that if they do share something, that in itself will be a breach, or there will be some liability arising from it, and they end up getting themselves into trouble. So I think, as I say, anecdotally, but I get the sense that at least some organisations, or put it a different way, if there was a safe space for companies to do that, then I think it would be more likely to happen, and more like, because the benefits are clear, as you've articulated. If somebody's the victim of an incident and that affected party lets their peers know about it, they can be on their guard and take steps to shore their systems up. So the benefits of that type of conversation are clear. Anecdotally, I wonder whether they're not happening because there's no protected safe space, and I guess regulatory a safe space introduced by the regulator to say, okay, you're allowed to do X, Y, and Z. I think that would help.
Now, can I just come in here, Caroline? Because just thinking as a consumer of products, I would rather buy from a company that I believe is honest and trustworthy, and I find it much better to, if a mistake has happened, to come out and say, look, we're aware of something that's happened and we're doing our best to sort it out, and we'll keep you informed, rather than pretending nothing's happened and find out much later. I think the reputational damage is much worse in the latter case than it has in the former case. It may seem counterintuitive, whatever the expression is, counterintuitive, but in my view, it's better to come out, come clean, even if it's just to say, we're aware of something, not sure what's going on, we'll keep you informed, in my opinion.
And if I can just pick up on Jonny's point as well, you know, we see the regulators as these great enforcement bodies, and I think the ICO is particularly a sort of terrifying one with its, you know, massive fines that it can impose. But I think the regulators do have a role in terms of that intelligence gathering piece. And I know other sectors where we are, you know, we encourage whistleblowers to, for example, in the charity sector, we encourage you to raise your concerns. It doesn't meet the threshold, which means that Charity Commission is going to do an investigation. But it's really useful intelligence for them, because when they add that to other matters about that charity, they might then trigger an investigation, or they pick up these trends that across the piece, these kind of frauds or these kind of issues are happening. So I think we need to, as Jonny said, encourage that thinking about a regulator as being an intelligence gatherer as well as just an enforcer, because I think that could be, that could get around to those issues about being terrified of putting things into the public domain, which would then damage your reputation or reduce confidence in your organisation. Although, wouldn't it be lovely if everybody thought like Phil and we all wanted to work for the, you know, and buy from and work with those kind of organisations?
It wouldn't be great if everybody thought like me, I tell you.
I just put in on that as well. We're talking around having a platform to share this information, and we actually do. Does anyone know what it's called? The Cyber Information Sharing Platform was created by the NCSC in 2013. I think was the initial basis of it. Or I think it was before the NCSC was actually formed, it was created. And that was a hope basically to let large organisations and smaller organisations share their cybersecurity information between one another. Obviously, the problem is no one's willing to share that cybersecurity information. And I think the main thing of that links down to, and sounds maybe quite philosophical, is really that we are a collectivist sort of society. And what you were saying there, Phil, about an organisation coming out and saying, yeah, we've been hit with a cyber attack, your data may have been leaked. Fantastic, it's everything what someone would want. However, what's the impacts of that? You know, it's cui bono, who benefits? And that is what cybersecurity is. Who benefits out of cybersecurity? You know, who benefits of coming out and saying, this is our cybersecurity structure, and sharing it with our competitor. It's going to knock you in the market value really against your competitor. So if you think about the regulator inside of that as well, it's sort of like a sword of Damocles. You've always got that fear of being hit with the regulated fines or being hit with the reputational damage. And in turn, does that spur cybersecurity, or does it spur organisations from shying away from it?
Can I just come back there, Dominic? You're absolutely right. But a couple of years back, or last year, we saw a significant cybersecurity attacks that affected 3 large public sector organisations in the region. One came absolutely clean, told exactly what they were doing about it. The others have hidden it away, and partly to legislation, partly lack of reputation or something. And I just personally feel that the former was the best approach, because I now have greater confidence in their ability to solve these problems.
Can I just say something about policies and minimum thresholds? It's lovely, Phil, that you are an ethical consumer and take the view that you would rather deal with companies who do take an ethical stance. But there's an absolute wealth of research that shows that if you ask somebody about those types of attitudes outside of context, they will agree with you and they'll say, yes, of course, we really care about how our data is being used and who has access to it and whether or not I'm dealing with an ethical company. But people make these decisions when they're in the midst of another task. So if they're buying something online, their goal is to make an online purchase. And there's a large number of studies to show that consumers simply don't read ethical policies, data policies, terms of service. And there was one notable experiment which measured the amount of time it would take an individual to read the terms of service, pushed this out as a social networking platform that people had to join, and then measured how much time they did spend. And on average, they were spending 2 to 3 seconds when it should have taken them 5 minutes to read. And in that study, they'd promised to sign over their firstborn child to the company. So the fact is, people don't read that information because they want to achieve another goal. So we sign up to things, and then shock horror down the line, we've got these ethical dilemmas of what's happened to our data? Why did I get into bed with this company? Well, the answer is they were selling or providing a service that you wanted at that time, and you didn't want to spend too much time thinking about it.
And actually, can I pick up on that? Because actually it links back to what Dominic was saying, or you were both saying earlier, about that thing about trying to do something in the media. Because it's quite brave, isn't it? As Liz has already, as Liz said, it is very, very, you're brave if you speak up. And because of the culture in the media, you're meant to look like an idiot. I remember when somebody tried to do so. I mean, I was lucky, but you do feel like an idiot, and so something needs to change there. And that's why I've sort of really applauded the chief executive of Maersk, because he was almost the first of, if I'm right, I think Jonny and Peter will know much more than me, but he was the first of the big guys. But he didn't do what other people have done. He stepped forward and said, yes, this has happened to us. And I think, really taken by what Jonny was talking about in terms of, the regulator not just being a sort of a hammer, but also trying to be a facilitator of the sharing of best practice, because in a way it works to what Liz was talking about, which is, when you have got people who spot something going wrong in their organisation, it's quite brave to say, actually, I've spotted something that's not quite right. And so you need things in place to make people have the courage to deliver on their own code of ethics. So I don't quite know. I think this is, honestly, Phil, I think this is such a difficult subject that, you know, in my head, as you know, I'm in a similar place to you. You know, it's always better to share, but I also know that there's always a cost of sharing. And I'd be, you know, again, particularly for small micro businesses, and that's the stock of the Northeast, really. You know, we're not the big guys. It's, you know, we're small businesses. It's sometimes very difficult to speak up, particularly if you're in a supply chain, particularly after a pandemic, particularly when you think, actually, if I just keep quiet here, I'm going to be able to survive until the next day. You know, that's a really, it's a difficult balance, isn't it?
Yes, I would like to come back on that question of the example that Sharon gave, and I think that's a really interesting angle. Is it right for companies to put terms and conditions in their business that they know people are not going to read? You know, especially when they've got something to do with your firstborn and that kind of thing. And, what's the ethical position on this? Sharon, I don't know whether you have a view. How would we legislate against this? How do we stop this happening? How do we make those terms and conditions more comprehensible?
I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of how information is presented to people. You know, using things like chunking, presenting just enough information, presenting things in an order where the key messages are at the top of the terms of service, and making sure that things, you know, that the user has another task, and reading this is only going to interfere with that task. So I think it's a way about how we structure the messages, perhaps using graphics instead of reams of text that nobody's going to read. There's a huge, you know, there's a PhD in that, actually. Somebody could easily do a nice PhD over 3 years to work out how to best structure those things. But it is just a given fact, you know, we all have limited time. We're usually interacting with websites or whatever to achieve a goal, and the last thing we want to do is spend 10 minutes reading boring legalese. Sorry, Jonny, but it's what happens, isn't it?
So if I could come to Liz, is this what happens with whistleblowing policies? So people just, I can't be bothered to read them, they're just too much.
Well, if that's what your whistleblowing policy is looking like, then, you know, come and talk to us, because we've got a model policy that doesn't look like that. It's really short, really crisp, and really talks to people about what is happening in their business. I think that's always the way, isn't it? I mean, these long terms and conditions, and I'm a lawyer too, so you can, you know, I can, you know, these long terms, they really cover, you know, they need to just be pertinent to what we're actually trying to achieve here, don't they? And a whistleblowing policy that says, you know, in this business, the biggest threats to us are around cybersecurity, or the biggest threats to us are that we're, you know, the widget that we're making isn't, you know, manufacturing defects, or the biggest problem for us is health and safety. You know, put that in your whistleblowing policy and really, you know, make it come to life by your training and your communications around it, because, you know, the policy itself is just the framework, the vehicle that sets out the kind of behaviours we want to see. But then you've got to live the behaviours as well. And just going back on that, you know, the consumer piece, I think there's a really interesting body of evidence that says that, that trust inside organisations also leads to business benefits in terms of the commitment, the engagement, the performance you get out of your staff. So even if we're, you know, not so sure that it's going to be great for our consumers, we can look at it in a positive light that way and say, well, look, if we create that kind of culture, the kind of behaviours in an organisation that mean that we're a trusted organisation, that our staff are then going to give us their best. And that's got to be a business benefit too.
Okay. Caroline, I've kind of taken over. And
I'm delighted you have. I am delighted you have. What I did want to ask, though, is this personal responsibility, because I think that we all have personal responsibility to action or inaction, and, you know, I think that's some of the threads that have come out today. I wanted to ask Liz, actually, just follow, she talked about her helpline and actually giving people advice on how to communicate, because I think that is absolutely invaluable. And is that in order to enable people to to act on their ethical behaviour and in order to get somewhere, Liz?
Absolutely. So we're quite an unusual legal advice centre because we have that two-pronged approach. So we will advise all our callers what their legal rights are under the Public Interest Disclosure Act. You should have rights not to be, treated badly as a whistleblower. But we also recognise that we have that public interest element. So we want to help people raise their concerns in the best way possible for that concern to be addressed. And so absolutely, whether we communicate that as here's a problem, or I think so-and-so is committing fraud, or, I wanted to bring this to the business's attention because I think there's a risk to the business, then we've got a different language. So I think the other thing is, and one of the great things about being here today is just Protect needs a much bigger profile, because getting that advice early can lead to better outcomes, both for the individual and for the concern. So always encourage people to come and get that advice before they raise their concerns if they possibly can.
And can I follow that up, because it connects back to what Dominc said, but it also to what Jonny said about this sharing best practice. Is there a way, because if people just think that they're operating, it's operating in isolation, it's very hard and very difficult. Whereas if there's a sort of anonymous resource, so that people can feel that there's a groundswell of more and more people making correct consumer purchases, really noticing and speaking up about poor performance or unethical performance in companies. If that begins to tip, and I think it is beginning to tip in the macro sense, in terms of a move towards a more sort of considerate capitalism, if you like, it'll tip faster if people feel that there's a groundswell behind them and they're not the one person out of 10 who's saying what the other 9 have agreed because it's easier.
I think that's a really good point. I think you're right that we're pushing an open door here, but I think there's a lot of appetite amongst the employers that we work with for holding those forums where you can speak about your whistleblowing arrangements and what the problems are you're facing and what does best practice look like. And I'm sure it's the same across the sort of the wider fraud and cybersecurity spectrum. We need those forums and those abilities to share across employers, and I think there's another role that the business support organisations, small and large organisations, can do to bring employers together to tackle these really. This isn't easy. It's all very well for us to say, put in a cultural change and getting your ethical structures right in an organisation is possibly one of the most challenging things you can do. And so let's all work together to get that support in place for people, and we'll do our bit at Protect to disseminate best practice as well we can.
That's smashing this. It's sort of some of the work that we've started at NIBE, which is actually to do an ethical business toolkit to try, and actually, as you've said, is to get people to shift that mindset that actually ethical business is good for business. It connects absolutely to what Phil was saying about, people should be sharing, because there is this move now led by the consumers that they're looking and actually potential employees, they're looking now at the behaviour of companies. They don't want to buy from companies who increasingly who behave unethically or irresponsibly, and they don't want to work for them. And I think it's something that we all need to work together, don't we? Because it's sharing good practice so that we can build, but changing the mindset of businesses that actually is better to behave. It is better for business to behave well.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And the premise behind thinking about this excellent discussion is actually doing nothing about this sort of thing, actually an unethical stance, and that you'll be shown up at some time. I think Paddy might want to come on this, because my understanding is that ignorance is no defence, but is ignoring the problem no defence against cybersecurity attacks.
I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. And from the wider conversation, we've talked about how ethically businesses can structure themselves, how ethically organisations like the ICO put safeguards and limitations in place to ensure that people are on the right track in relation to their organisation's behaviours. But this really comes down to individuals. And for me, ethical decision making, it's about living your life with integrity and doing the right thing, you know, even when people aren't watching. Now, I think most people would like to think that they are individuals with integrity, with good ethical grounding. And if you are going to be a founder, if you are going to be a CEO, or you're going to be a member of staff within an organization, I think there is that greater pull now that you want to work for organizations that reflect the same standards that you believe in, that you want to see in other people. And that's good because, like I say, most people are ethical. Most people will look at it in that way. There are difficult decisions. That is certainly something that isn't said lightly. And when it becomes an issue around the success of a business, or, you know, the survival of a business, that can't be said with any greater impact. But at the end of the day, you are still the person, whether you are the individual within a company or you are the person who's running that company. You are still the person who has that ability to influence whether you make the right decision. I know Dominic's thrown in a few quotes today, but there's a Zen Buddhist quote I love, and it's
is it me, or is it Paddy that's frozen?
Just at the critical time as well.
Yeah, exactly. We were all hanging on for that. Oh, he's gone. He's gone black.
Paddy, are you there? You disappeared. You were just about to give us that quote, and you froze.
Sorry, is that where am I back? I've got low bandwidth now. Yeah, the quote is, "How you do anything is how you do everything," and I think that really does sort of align the decision-making process. So if you are a decision-maker in a company, you decide to be inactive and not to do something, then that's something that you're going to live with. You know, you might have made that decision during work, but if that's against your core values, if that's against your ethical beliefs, you're going to go home and you're going to be carrying that around for the foreseeable future. So I think there is a natural push in all of us to make these right decisions. And like I say, it's just whether that is an easy decision, whether it's a hard decision, and then the last part of it is whether we're willing to make it.
So it reminds me of that quote from Martin Luther King, which I paraphrase, but in effect said, "Good is good, whether there's anybody there or not to see it." And you know, so doing the right thing is doing the right thing, isn't it? And these days, though, our supply chains are so strongly interlinked, and you know, we rely upon relationships with many other businesses in order to deliver this. And therefore, I think it's just not acceptable to not play a part in providing a secure system for the consumer to buy from, in my opinion. Discuss.
May I come back? My old dad, I'm not going to quote anybody apart from my old dad. My old dad said, Caroline, you'll be all right if you do the right thing for the right reason. Connects absolutely what you're saying, Paddy. But my word, it's tough. It is really tough. And I think that's why when Phil asked me to do this, I thought, oh, this is really tough, because we're all going to think differently and our own moral compass is going to be different. And yet what we're trying to do is navigate a world that is changing. You know, our world is changing at an exponential rate. The regulators can't keep up with the breach. Big data has its own set of ethical challenges, and we're sort of, and I suppose the only thing we can hold on to is actually our own personal belief of trying to do the right thing for the right reason.
Yeah, I think if I can just come back on that point that you said there, and the scale, if you look at fraud, you could turn around and say to everyone on this call, right, there is a victim of romance fraud who's been misled, someone's pretended to be someone that they haven't, and they've been groomed and they've lost their life savings. Everyone will say that that is bad, and it's a fraud and it's financial abuse. You might also then have Jim down the pub is selling chipped Amazon Fire Sticks that mean that you get the football for free if you buy it, and actually when you're not getting it, you're not paying the money that you should be paying, and you're getting around the system and things like that. There's a much higher level of tolerance to something like that. It's still fraud, it's still a crime and things like that, but people will go, oh well, I've been overcharged for years, and there's this. It just comes down to that individual standard that you've just mentioned there.
And right the way back to where we started, actually, you started, Paddy, and you and Phil started. It was that this is not victimless crime.
No.
So absolutely, it always comes back to us, doesn't it, to do that checking.
Mm.
Phil, I can't say any more. I've learned so much this morning. My head's full, like a sort of full thing, whatever a head is. It's been absolutely fantastic hearing all of these different perspectives. But I'm going to hand over to you because I'm brained out and talked out.
Well, at least I've achieved something today, Caroline, and got your brain dead from that. That was great. I think this is a great place to stop. There's been a very interesting discussion, and I think my view hasn't changed. There is still an ethical dimension to this about what you should be doing. You should be doing the right thing. You should be aware of your cybersecurity implications, if not for you, but for those people who consume your products and rely upon your services. I think it's been fascinating here, the different perspectives from the police, from the legal aspects, from academia, both post and sort of within the learning system. And it's been fascinating, I think, to hear from Liz and how we bring this all together into some sort of how policies, but more about communication. And I think ethos of an organisation is exactly where it is that we want to go. So I'm going to call that a day in terms of this event. Obviously, I'd like to thank enormously Paddy, Jonny, Peter, Sharon, Dominic, Liz, and yourself, Caroline. And of course, I'm going to thank the swan like Claire, who helps me to get these events online. Believe me, it's extremely hard in these under quite strenuous circumstances at times. And of course, I'd like to thank you all for coming. As I said, there's a whole series of events still to come. If you're interested in the relationship between art and cybersecurity, who isn't? There's an event on this afternoon in Sunderland at 4 o'clock where you can see real people in the flesh and some real artwork. Next week, we've got 4 events. One about building a cybersecurity business, if you're interested in that. One about cybersecurity across manufacturing and industry and supply chains, some of the stuff that we just talked about, which is being hosted by Teesside University, sorry. Then we've got an event on a region of growing cybersecurity innovation. We're hearing for 3 firms who are innovating in the region on cybersecurity, and then cybersecurity skills and employment will finish that week. And then there's 3 events the following week out, but please look out for that on the information that if you just search for Cyberfest, you'll find it. But thank you very much, all your speakers and everybody who's in the audience, and we'll be replying to the questions, the many questions that came through, which we've not been able to answer on the webpage. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.